A chilling discovery in a Florida ditch clues police into a brutal crime.
There's a decomposing body in a ditch.
He had been stabbed more than 40 times.
It's possible that our victim wasn't even able to scream.
Did a former flame become deadly?
Do you know who the girl was?
I don't even know who she was.
Or did a secret double life spiral out of control?
She had a criminal history. She was involved in narcotics and things of that nature.
She had been cheating on him.
She went over to dude's house, hung out with him.
That car was set on fire. It was completely destroyed.
There's nowhere to run now.
Go ahead, step out for me.
She turned on him 100%.
She was tired of the lies.
The contempt, the deception, the lack of trust all led to this deadly recipe.
August 12, 2020, Geneva, Florida. It's a calm, tropical afternoon in the lush landscape of Seminole County.
Geneva is really close to Orlando. It's about 30 minutes north. It's more rural, and so there are less people, less attractions.
There are areas that are wooded and secluded. It's kind of reminds you like when people think of the country.
But at 3:20 p.m., a chilling call sends shockwaves through the county sheriff's office.
A man was walking in the area of Settlers Loop in Geneva when he made a startling discovery.
911, police, fire, medical.
Police, Settlers Loop. There's a decomposing body in the ditch.
There's a body in the ditch decomposing.
Correct. It looks like maybe an African-American naked body.
When police arrive at the scene, it's just as the caller described.
They find an unidentified black male on the side of the road in early stages of decomposition, without any clothing, disposed like garbage.
It's clear the victim suffered a violent death.
He had been stabbed more than 40 times, all over his body, including his head.
So the level of aggression and the level of violence in this case is a telltale sign that it's a crime of passion. It's somebody knows this person, and they want to make sure this person is dead.
But who is he?
The victim was nude, and there was no ID.
If the suspect has time, they tend to get rid of the victim's cell phone, the murder weapon, whether it's a gun, a knife, a blunt instrument. So we never found the knife.
It was just the body. That's all police had to go on.
So investigators decide to run a fingerprint analysis.
When you have somebody with no identification on them, no identifiable tattoos at that time due to the early stages of decomposition, and you want to identify your victim very quickly, fingerprints would be the best way to do it. It's the quickest method.
And when police run the prints, they immediately get a hit.
It was at this time that they were able to determine the victim was 30-year-old Joel Cosby.
Joel Rashad Cosby was known by loved ones as a sharp-witted family man.
He was one of the funniest people ever, whether it was dancing or singing or telling a joke. Joel was always the person to make everybody laugh.
He was real tall, so we'll play basketball. Of course, he'll show out and joke on me, or dunk over my head or stuff like that. He was definitely a jokester.
In fact, Joel was a man of many talents.
He did love music. He did rap, actually. He did love to rap.
He could be rapping to his sister. It'll be funny and it'll rhyme at the same time. That was one hell of a combination.
But nothing was more important to Joel than being a father.
In 2015, Joel's girlfriend, Jasmine, gave birth to their daughter, Jelani.
When he held her, it was different. He did not put her down, like, the entire time that he was in the hospital with her.
He overly loved her. Very hands-on.
She looked just like him. I mean, it was a beautiful thing.
However, the union between Joelle and Jelani's mother, Jasmine, wasn't meant to last.
It wasn't one of those things like, I don't love you, I don't want to be with you. It's just my life is not where your life is.
So Jasmine basically ended that relationship, but the two ended in good terms and were still close.
At some point, it just didn't work out, but he wanted to be a good dad to his daughter. So they just co-parented together and remained friends.
In the meantime, Joelle took a job at a local car dealership to help provide for Jelani.
We worked there for a while. We was doing detailing work, and we started doing outside of work. Some customers or friends of ours will start detailing their cars.
When he wasn't busy working or spending time with his daughter, Joelle dipped his toes back into the dating pool. And that's when he met Jade Caparelli.
Early 2016 is when she started to pop up.
He always been somewhat of a ladies' man.
Had an amazing time.
I did too. Literally, all of the girls were so attracted to him.
However, Jade seemed like more than just a fling.
They connected over the fact that they were both parents.
Jade had 2 children, a girl and a boy.
Eventually, their relationship grew into something really passionate.
But 5 years later, Joelle has been identified as the John Doe stabbed and discarded in Geneva, just 9 miles from his home.
Based on the crime scene, they surmised that he was killed elsewhere.
He was stabbed over 45 times, so the person's going to bleed. They're going to bleed a lot, but it was a noted lack of blood around the body.
He was nude, there was no weapon they could find, and there was no blood at the scene. They have no clues to even start this investigation.
As CSI continues processing the crime scene, detectives prepare to deliver the tragic news to Joelle's loved ones.
That was the worst day of my life. And I lost it.
I'm so sorry.
I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing.
My body got cold. It's just a feeling like you're so torn and broken, like, wow, this can't be real.
Unfortunately, Joelle's family has no idea who could have done this.
Is there any reason he would have been in the Geneva area?
They didn't really have any ties to that area specifically, at all. They didn't have, a prior address there or had a friend or anything like that.
You don't mess with nobody. I keep saying he's a clown. It was never nothing, no serious, no guns, none of that.
He seemed like a good guy and did not have any enemies, and so they couldn't imagine who would want to harm him.
Can you tell me about the last time you spoke with Joelle?
The last time his family had seen him was about 1 week earlier.
He's known for, I'm gonna come over and then I probably see y'all in 3 days, 4 days, but I'm okay. That was normal.
His mother is able to tell the police that she had seen her son on Sunday, August 9th, around 9:30 p.m.
Joelle was in the Midway area. He had visited his mother. He was eating dinner over at her house.
He stayed for about an hour just conversing with his mother and then left around 10:30 p.m.
Don't forget to call me when you get
I will. Love you.
All right, baby. Love you.
But it's who he left with that makes detectives' ears perk up.
As her son was leaving, she was able to look into the car and she saw his on-again, off-again girlfriend, Jade, sitting in the driver's seat.
I never thought she was good enough for my son.
After becoming a father and setting off on a new path for himself, 30-year-old Joelle Cosby had found a kindred spirit in Jade Caparelli.
Joelle and Jade hit it off. She was also a parent.
Joelle was still very active in his daughter's life from his previous relationship.
He was definitely a funny, hands-on dad.
But now Joel has been the victim of a brutal stabbing. And in speaking with his mother, it seems Jade Caparelli may have been the last person to see him alive.
Joel's mom recalls seeing him get into a white Dodge vehicle.
As her son was leaving, she was able to look into the car and she saw his on-again, off-again girlfriend, Jade, sitting in the driver's seat.
According to Joel's family, Jade is nothing but trouble.
I always thought that she was not good enough for my son.
His mother was one of the first people. She's like, I don't like her.
Jade had a criminal history. She was involved in narcotics and things of that nature. Joel's family knew of Joel and Jade's relationship. They described it as toxic. You know, the way they spoke to each other and arguing and things like that.
What's your problem now, Jade?
No, I know you're lying.
You're lying about what?
They would talk and then they wouldn't talk. They would block each other. They would not speak. They would be back together.
You know what? I'm done with this, man. You're crazy.
After learning about Joel's rocky relationship with Jade, detectives are eager to speak with her, but she's not easy to get a hold of.
We got her phone number and tried different addresses and finally were able to get in touch with her.
She agrees to meet them at the station for an interview.
We're here in reference to, as you're aware of, the death of Joel Cosby. Raise your right hand for me. You swear that everything you tell me today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes.
Detectives begin the interview by asking Jade about her relationship with Joel.
Me and Joel have been on and off for like 5 years. I love him.
But she admits the relationship had its issues.
He's left a few times and got involved with like another girl.
Do you know who the girl was?
There was another little white girl. I don't even know who she was.
Jade also told investigators that Joel was still close with his child's mother, Jasmine.
However, despite their ups and downs, Jade says she and Joel always came back together.
She says they'd recently gotten closer than ever.
In fact, she says they even went apartment hunting last week.
We were looking for a place, so he was looking.
Okay. When was the last time you guys were together?
This weekend.
What day?
Sunday. Sunday's the last time.
Okay, tell me about that day.
Jade says she and Joel hung out all afternoon, and she dropped him off at his mom's house around 9:30 p.m.
Did you ever go to his mom's house?
No, I didn't go in there and speak to her or anything.
While Joel was eating dinner with his mom, Jade went to run some errands.
She confirms that she picked Joel up from his mom's house around 11 p.m.
Jade says after that, she drove Joel to his home and left him there.
You left him at the house?
Yes. He went inside.
You leave him around midnight, somewhere, give or take?
Yeah.
Drive straight home?
Yes, I went straight home.
Jade said when she tried calling Joel the next morning, she didn't get an answer.
What time did you call him next day?
I called him probably around 5, 6.
In the morning or p.m.?
No, in the morning when I got up.
Okay. What are you up so early?
I usually can't sleep very much, to be honest.
But when detectives ask Jade what happened next, she makes a shocking admission.
She met up with another man on Monday.
And you immediately went the absolute next day, the next morning, Monday morning.
Another dude.
Seminole County detectives investigating the stabbing death of beloved 30-year-old father Joel Cosby are speaking with his girlfriend, Jade Caparelli.
The Monday after Joel went missing, she met up with another man.
You immediately went the absolute next day, the next morning, Monday morning.
Another dude.
It was her ex-boyfriend, Marvin Bryant.
What's your relationship with Marvin? Is it still intimate?
Not really.
Not really, or no, or yes?
No.
Jade explains that Marvin is the father of one of her children, and they still maintain a friendly co-parenting relationship.
So you get up the next morning and you drive back to Marvin's house in Orlando. Where does he live in Orlando?
He lives in Apopka.
Detectives are now wondering if Marvin had an axe to grind with Joelle. Is this a love triangle situation?
What does Marvin think of Joelle?
He doesn't really know Joelle to think of it.
Did they ever talk?
They don't talk to each other.
Jade insists Marvin would never hurt Joelle.
So he's a good guy?
Yeah, he's very good.
And even when Jade was at Marvin's, she says she was still trying to get a hold of Joelle.
She claims she continued trying to reach out to Joelle in the following days.
Keep trying?
I called.
Did you ever think about reporting him missing?
Well, no, he did that all the time. Joelle went back and forth all the time.
I get that.
Jade is getting more and more frustrated as police press her for answers.
I'm trying my best to tell you whatever you want to know and tell you the truth. Like, I love Joelle.
At that point, Jade ends the interview.
Let me get an attorney, please.
I'm not doing this with you guys.
Investigators are still very suspicious of Jade and her story, but they have nothing to hold her on.
You're free to go, but we will see you again, and it's not going to be as pleasant.
Once Jade leaves, detectives are eager to speak with her ex, Marvin Bryant. But before they can make a move, Marvin shows up on his own.
On Saturday, August 15th, Marvin Bryant walks into the Seminole County Sheriff's Office stating that he believes that he is the prime suspect in a murder case.
That doesn't happen every day. You don't have somebody coming into the police station saying stuff like that.
You came in and told the deputy you're the prime suspect in a homicide. What was that all about?
I thought it was, man. Somebody dies. She talking about her friend died. Well, I'm just a little scared.
With no prior criminal history, Marvin wanted to make sure his name wasn't being dragged into something it shouldn't be.
He talked to Jade, and he felt that, well, maybe he should give a statement too, to try to maybe absolve him of any suspicion.
Who did she tell you died?
The dude she was dating while we were broke up.
He says at the 5-year mark, they broke up for about a year.
But unlike Jade's statement, he says they are still in a relationship.
And that he lives with Jade and their children in Deltona.
Why would she tell us you live in Apopka? Why would she say that?
I'm not sure about that.
At that time, detectives realized that these three are in a love triangle. Jade has been dating them both.
Detectives let Marvin know that Jade has said that she actually saw Joelle that weekend.
Well, I'll tell you what she told us. She went over dude's house that died. Hung out with him. Now, I know it sucks.
This makes Marvin visibly upset.
One can only speculate what Marvin Bryant was thinking at this time. He has to feel betrayed by Jade, his girlfriend of 10 years.
Detectives redirect their line of questioning to the Monday after Joelle went missing.
Okay. Monday, what happened? Y'all stay home all day?
All day, pretty much. Well, I mean, we probably ran errands again.
Together?
Walmart, like that.
That's when detectives noticed something about Marvin's hands.
Okay, let me stop real quick.
Detectives notice Marvin Bryant has cuts on both of his hands.
Police realize that this may be signs of a struggle.
Detectives investigating the murder of 30-year-old Joel Cosby have just learned he was involved in a love triangle with his girlfriend, Jade Caparelli, and Jade's other boyfriend, Marvin Bryant.
In speaking with Marvin, they noticed some suspicious cuts on his hands.
He just tried to slough it off like they weren't there. But there were multiple healing cuts on different areas of his hands.
What you're telling me, I know is not truthful. I'm gonna tell you straight up, it's not truthful.
Honestly, I don't want nothing to do with it because this looks real bad on me now.
Given that the victim was stabbed, 40 plus times, your hand can slip down and actually get cut on the blade yourself.
But when they press him on it, Marvin ends the interview.
Look, okay, I'm gonna have to ask for a lawyer now.
Okay.
However, investigators have what they need to obtain a search warrant for the home Marvin shares with Jade.
When we conducted the search warrant at the house, there wasn't really anything of evidentiary value within that house.
But outside the home is a different story.
Immediately, they pick up on some suspicious things.
We saw that fresh red mulch had been spread around a couple different planter areas.
Detectives also noticed in the driveway there was one spot in particular that looked cleaner than the surrounding driveway, as if it had been pressure washed.
And the final red flag? Marvin's car appears to be missing.
His car is nowhere to be found. Marvin now claims it was stolen.
I think Marvin thought, I'll report it stolen, and that way I'm not looked at as a suspect because I'm a victim of a vehicle theft.
Detectives think there's more to the story. They issue an APB for the vehicle, a white Ford Mustang.
I want every patrol unit keeping an eye out for that vehicle.
And before long, they get a hit.
That car was set on fire over in Lake County. It was completely destroyed. It was burned to the ground.
Which means any potential evidence has been destroyed with it.
Police aren't able to pull any DNA or fingerprints or anything off of that car.
Regardless, investigators believe they're onto something. So they begin retracing Jade and Marvin's movements in the hours leading up to Joel's murder.
During Marvin's interview, he mentioned that he and Jade had ran some errands at Walmart.
So detectives decided to obtain that security video to see what the couple was doing in the store.
They see Jade and Marvin enter into the Walmart around 7:45 a.m. and make a beeline directly for the cleaning supplies.
They're buying a large amount of cleaning products, just various cleaning products, and 2 bags of red mulch.
Next, detectives get a warrant for the vehicle Jade was driving the night she picked Joel up from his mother's house.
Detectives have it towed back to their headquarters to get their CSI team to go through it.
You can spray luminol or Blue Star reagent in an area that you suspect may have some type of substance that could be reactive. So when you do that, it will glow a nice bright blue color.
Based on the test, there are clear signs of a cleanup inside the car.
They were able to recover blood DNA evidence out of the back seat of that vehicle.
Does the blood belong to Joel Cosby?
In order to figure out who this blood belonged to, investigators would have to send it off to a lab.
While detectives await the results, they pull phone records for Joel, Jade, and Marvin.
Phone records show Jade picking up Joel at his mother's house and then going to his house.
But they don't stop there.
Around midnight, his phone shows him traveling with Jade to the home she shared with Marvin in Deltona.
Jade said that the last time she saw Joel was when she dropped him off at home. She never mentioned anything about him coming over to her house that night.
During that same time, Marvin's phone is at the house in Deltona. Jade's phone then reunites and connects with Marvin's phone at her house. After that, Joel's phone essentially goes silent.
However, By 2 a.m., Marvin and Jade's phones keep moving.
Jade and Marvin's phone then travel together down 415 and several other areas within Volusia County and Seminole County.
The phones eventually land in Geneva, at the same spot Joelle's body was found 2 days later.
There's now no question that Marvin and Jade are behind the murder.
And when the DNA results from the blood found in Jade's car come in, it confirms that assertion.
There was enough in the back seat to be able to positively identify that to our victim.
Now, at this point, investigators have enough evidence to get arrest warrants for both Jade and Marvin.
Let's bring them in.
Once we got the arrest warrants for both Marvin and Jade, we sent the crime suppression team in Deltona, which is a plainclothes tactical unit.
And it doesn't take long before the couple is spotted on the highway.
There's nowhere to run now.
Officers pull them over under the guise of a routine traffic stop.
Go ahead and step out for me, Jada.
On December 4th, 2020, investigators have moved in to arrest Marvin Bryant and Jade Caparelli for the murder of Jade's boyfriend, 30-year-old Joel Cosby.
Jada, go ahead and step out for me, Jada. Come back here with me. What's your full name?
Jade Caparelli.
All right.
Well, I'd like to know why I'm under arrest.
I'll explain to you in just a minute.
Are you Marvin?
They ordered them to get out so that they could arrest them and take them to jail. And those two are charged with first-degree murder.
What am I being arrested for? You think you're a fantastic job, everyone.
I kind of knew she had something to do with it or she done it. So it was a little justice for my family, even though they still was grieving.
After they arrested, they didn't want to speak to us. They basically just asked for the lawyers, and that was really it.
However, in the days leading to trial, Jade has a change of heart.
Jade's attorney reached out to the state attorney's office and told them that she wanted to confess and wanted to come clean and see if there was anything that can be done for her case. So we obliged.
Prosecutors allowed Jade to plead guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder in exchange for a full confession and testifying against Marvin at trial.
She turned on him 100%.
She was tired of the lies. She was tired of nobody really knowing the truth or her side.
But when Jade sits down with prosecutors, the truth isn't what they expected.
Jade claims she's been a victim of domestic violence at the hands of Joel Cosby.
If there was anything in my phone, anybody else, that we were gonna fight. It was gonna be a fight. This guy was beating the shit out of me on a regular basis.
But investigators are skeptical. By all accounts, Joel would never hurt a woman, and there are no reports backing Jade's claims.
We didn't have any documentation or any law enforcement reports in recent time that showed any type of violence between Jade and Joel.
Jade says that's because she tried to keep it all under wraps.
She says at first she didn't want to talk about it because she was embarrassed and afraid.
My mom suffered a lot of abuse when I was younger, and she told me not to let anybody do that to me. And I was too scared to call the cops because I sold drugs. I felt like I would have gotten in trouble.
She also didn't want to tell Marvin because Marvin did not know she was in a relationship with Joel, and she would have to admit that she had been cheating on him.
But Jade claims eventually she could no longer hide it.
What happened?
I'm fine. It got really bad one time where Joel actually hit me in my face, punched me. I came home and told a whole lie, but I ended up telling Marvin what happened. And he was just like, well, let me get at him, let me fight him.
Marvin, of course, is hearing Jade's side of the violence, and I think Marvin didn't like that she was still talking to Joelle.
Here you are, you know, as what is supposed to be a man, and you're living with this girl who you clearly see is with somebody else.
I'm sorry, I won't see him again.
But she couldn't stay away and continued two-timing both men.
So when Jade decided to get together with Joelle on the night of the 9th, tensions were already running high.
She said after she dropped him off at home, they got into an argument because she didn't want to spend the night.
You really not gonna stay tonight?
I already told you I'm not staying tonight.
Yo, so where you going?
It doesn't matter. Just leave me alone.
So I jumped up and grabbed my stuff so I could go home. And he jumped in my car. And I was just like, I'm gonna bring you to Marvin so he can fight you. And I called Marvin and told him, hey, he's in the car, he's not getting out, I'm bringing him over.
Bring it, let's go, start the car, let's go, I'm ready.
He wasn't going to back down from Marvin. You know, he didn't mind confronting him and just being like, what's your problem? And we believe that's why he willingly got into that car with Jade to ride over the house.
But when they arrived in Deltona, Joelle never could have anticipated the fury that awaited him.
Joelle was walking basically into a trap.
When I pulled up to the driveway, Marvin was already in the driveway.
It was such a quick and brutal attack.
You didn't even give him a chance to defend himself.
In June of 2023, accused killer Jade Caparelli is finally giving a confession regarding the events that took the life of her boyfriend, 30-year-old Joel Cosby.
She admits she drove him to her home in Deltona, Florida, where she lived with her other boyfriend, Marvin.
The intention was for Marvin to beat Joel up.
But Jade claims she never anticipated what happened next.
Marvin opened his door, he hit him.
You didn't even give him a chance to defend himself. You know, you had to surprise him with the attack.
As far as I could see, I thought they were just fighting.
According to her, it just looked like Marvin was hitting Joelle.
Joelle tried to get away from the attack, but it was such a quick and brutal attack that Marvin met him over there and continued outside on the ground.
Jade says once she realized what was really going on, she was paralyzed by fear.
It's possible that our victim wasn't even able to scream. If his lungs had been punctured and his neck was stabbed so many times, it's possible that he couldn't even make a sound at that point.
But eventually, the severity of Joelle's injuries was clear.
I saw Joel was bleeding, you know. I mean, I watched Joel die. And in my mind, like, I was like, I want to help him, but I didn't. I panicked.
It's kind of shocking that there were no witnesses to this crime, considering this all happened in the driveway.
Let's keep in mind this happens, you know, in the early hours of the morning. There's not really a lot of traffic on the roadways. There's not a ton of exterior lights or street lights or really anything like that in the area that would have just like lit this place up.
Jade says once Joelle was dead, Marvin started giving her orders.
Marvin was like, you know, just be quiet, just get in your car, follow me. I watched him pull Joel into the car, and I followed him. And he went out to Geneva. I don't remember exactly where we were.
She waited in the car for Marvin while he took off all of Joel's clothes, leaving him naked, and disposed of his body by the side of the road.
Marvin then put Joel's bloody clothes into the back of Jade's car, which would explain the blood evidence police later found.
Follow me back to the house, okay?
Okay.
Did you ever see what he was stabbing him with?
No, he got rid of that. When he threw away all his clothes, he threw that in the trash too. Like, he literally put all that stuff in the trash, and the trash people took it.
In the following days, the couple worked tirelessly to erase the rest of the evidence.
He didn't die from a single stab wound. There was a lot of blood in the driveway.
In order to cover it up, they even bought red mulch in order to soak up some of that blood.
They thought it would blend in and they could easily help dispose of that large amount of blood evidence that was there. But it didn't work.
Damn it, man. Well, let's just throw this on the tree and figure something else out.
He went and rented one of the pressure washers. He pressure washed the driveway, and after he finished, it just looked like, every other driveway with oil stains in it.
Then there was the issue of the two cars, which both had blood evidence inside.
They bought the cleaning supplies from Walmart and attempted to clean the blood from the backseat of Jade's car.
What are we gonna do about your car?
But when it came to Marvin's car, they had to devise a new plan.
There was so much blood in the Ford that there was no way they could clean it up.
So they decided to drive it to Lake County and set it on fire.
Is there anything else you think we really need to know that maybe we didn't ask you?
No.
That'll conclude it. It is approximately 2:19 p.m., 19 hours. With Jade's cooperation in the prosecution against Marvin, we had a tight case.
Armed with Jade's statement, prosecutors enter Marvin's June 2024 trial feeling fully prepared.
Detectives from both Volusia and Seminole County testify at the trial and weave the tapestry for how this murder occurred.
According to the prosecution, Marvin was a cold and calculated killer.
Marvin was at the house waiting. So Joelle was showing up to an ambush, attacker laying in wait with a knife.
It would lead one to believe that, in this case, Marvin Bryant had a lot of time to think about what he wanted to do and how he wanted to do it.
In his assault, Marvin stabbed Joelle over 45 times wherever he could. Head, neck, and torso.
To support their claims, prosecutors called Jade Caparelli to the stand.
Jurors hear about Jade's on-again, off-again relationships with Joelle and with Marvin.
She recites the same account to jurors as she did in her recorded confession.
It was a very strong case going to prosecution, even without her statement or without her cooperation.
During cross-examination, Marvin's defense team doesn't go easy on Jade.
They essentially pinned the case back on Jade, and that he was just helping her and he was just kind of standing by.
However, the jury isn't buying it.
Jurors find Marvin guilty of first-degree murder. He's ultimately sentenced to life in prison.
Marvin didn't really show much reaction to anything going on. He just sat there watching.
He wasn't, say, remorseful. I just feel like he realized how stupid what he did was. And the fact that, my life is over.
In exchange for her testimony, Jade is granted the plea deal she was initially promised.
She pled and accepted a reduced charge of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 35 years in prison. She gets credit for time served, and she has to serve roughly 80% of that time.
It was definitely a case where, no one like that needs to be free at all. But I believe it was some justice served.
Though Joelle's killers are now behind bars, it doesn't ease the pain of this truly senseless murder.
At the end of the day, the contempt, the deception, the lack of transparency all led to this deadly recipe that cost Joelle Cosby his life.
Now, not only is his daughter without a father, your daughter will never be able to see you ever again. You ruined your life just as much as you ruined all of these other people's lives.
However, through their grief, Joelle's family has found strength in their memories of.
There are cold cases that remain mysteries because investigators never find a suspect, and then there are cold cases that become something even more haunting because the killer seems determined to remind everyone that he is still out there. For 30 years, the murder of 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley belonged to that second category. On April 1st, still 1988, a little girl disappeared in Fort Wayne, Indiana, after leaving a friend's house to retrieve an umbrella. It was Good Friday. She was supposed to be home. Instead, somewhere between an ordinary afternoon and the place where she vanished, her life was violently taken away. 3 days later, her body was discovered in a rural ditch in DeKalb County, roughly 20 miles from the neighborhood where she had disappeared. The discovery transformed a missing child investigation into a murder investigation, and the question that would follow investigators for decades was brutally simple. Who took April Tinsley? The search began immediately. April's disappearance had already triggered an enormous response, but finding her body changed everything. Investigators now had a crime scene, a grieving family, a frightened community, and an unknown offender who had seemingly vanished without leaving behind a clear identity. A witness later reported seeing a white man forcing a girl matching April's description into a blue pickup truck. But a description was not a name. A vehicle was not an identity, and the clock was already working against investigators. In an era before the modern explosion of forensic DNA technology, evidence that would eventually become decisive could not yet provide the answer. The investigation continued, but the killer remained free. Years passed. The photograph of April remained in police files. Her name remained associated with one of Fort Wayne's most disturbing unsolved crimes. Then, 2 years after the murder, something happened that made the case even more disturbing. A message appeared on a barn door near the location where April's body had been recovered. The writer claimed responsibility for killing 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley and threatened to kill again. Investigators now faced a horrifying possibility. The person responsible was not simply hiding. He might still be watching. The message became another piece of evidence in a case already filled with unanswered questions. But it also became psychological warfare. The community had no idea who was responsible, yet someone knew exactly what had happened to April. Someone knew where her body had been found. Someone was willing to put words onto a public surface and challenge the authorities to find him. And then the years continued. The case did not disappear, even when the trail seemed to. Investigators kept working. April's photograph continued to circulate. Tips were pursued. Evidence was preserved. The FBI eventually became involved, and in 2009, a specialized child abduction rapid deployment team joined Indiana investigators in a renewed effort to examine the case. The FBI described the investigation as containing significant evidence, including notes, photographs, and DNA associated with the offender. Agents and local detectives revisited neighborhoods, interviewed residents, examined old information, and tried to understand a crime that had resisted solution for more than 2 decades. But the killer's trail remained frustratingly incomplete. In 2004, 16 years after April's murder, another disturbing development occurred. Notes appeared around Fort Wayne, some placed on bicycles belonging to young girls. The notes were accompanied by used condoms or photographs, and several referred directly to April Tinsley. Investigators believe the material had been left by the same person responsible for the 1988 murder. The significance was enormous. The case was no longer simply a decades-old crime with an unidentified offender. The person investigators were seeking appeared to have resurfaced, yet even with new evidence, the killer remained unidentified. The DNA existed, the messages existed, the photographs existed, but the name did not. That was the nightmare of the April Tinsley case. Evidence could point toward a person without telling investigators who that person was. For April's family, 30 years was an unimaginable amount of time to live with uncertainty. For investigators, the case became a measure of persistence. Every year that passed made the original investigation older, but it did not make the evidence disappear. In fact, some evidence became more valuable as technology advanced. DNA science was changing the way investigators approached unsolved crimes across the United States. Profiles that once seemed incapable of producing an identification could potentially be analyzed in new ways. Genetic genealogy introduced another possibility. Instead of searching only for the exact person whose DNA was present, investigators could search for biological relatives and use those relationships to reconstruct a family tree. Indiana State Police now describes forensic investigative genetic genealogy as a technique that can generate leads when an unidentified DNA profile does not produce a traditional CODIS match. The approach can involve SNP DNA data, law enforcement accessible genealogy databases, and traditional genealogical research. That concept would become critical in the Tinsley investigation. In 2018, investigators revisited the DNA evidence with modern technology. The goal was no longer simply to compare the unknown profile with a database of known offenders. The question became broader. Could the DNA itself reveal a family connection? The answer began to emerge. Investigators worked with Parabon Nanolabs, a company involved in forensic DNA analysis, and genealogist Cease Moore used genetic genealogy to narrow the field of possible relatives. The investigation eventually focused on two brothers. One of them was John D. Miller, a 59-year-old man from Grabille, Indiana. Suddenly, after 30 years, the investigation had something it had never possessed before: a name. But a name was not enough. Investigators needed confirmation. They needed evidence that could withstand scrutiny. They needed to move from a genealogical lead to a legally meaningful identification. That distinction mattered. Modern genetic genealogy can point investigators toward a person, but the suspect must still be confirmed through additional DNA testing and other evidence. Indiana State Police guidance emphasizes that forensic genetic genealogy is an investigative lead and that a potential suspect should not be arrested solely on the genealogical identification. Detectives began watching Miller. They needed a DNA sample. They did not simply walk into his home and demand one. According to court documents reported at the time, investigators collected discarded material from Miller's track. Among that material were used condoms. The DNA recovered from those items was then compared with the evidence from the Tinsley investigation and the material associated with the messages left in 2004. The results were devastating for the mystery that had survived for 3 decades. The DNA was consistent with the genetic profile investigators had been pursuing. The investigation had crossed another threshold. The family tree had pointed toward Miller. Surveillance had helped investigators obtain discarded DNA. The forensic comparison connected that DNA to the evidence preserved from the case. And now detectives had a reason to believe that the man living in Indiana decades after April's murder was the same person whose biological evidence had been sitting inside an evidence file since 1988. The cold case was beginning to thaw. On July 15th, SIL 2018, investigators went to Miller's home. Fort Wayne Police and Indiana State Police were involved. Miller agreed to go to the police department and speak with detectives. He was advised of his rights. Investigators then asked him whether he knew why they wanted to talk to him. According to the probable cause affidavit, his response was the name that had haunted the investigation for 30 years. April Tinsley. The words carried extraordinary weight because April's name had appeared repeatedly throughout the investigation. It had been written into messages. It had been printed on case files. It had been spoken by investigators, family members, witnesses, and journalists. But now, according to investigators, it was coming from the man they believed was responsible. Miller allegedly made incriminating statements about abducting April, sexually assaulting her, and killing her. Those statements were documented in the probable cause affidavit. Authorities arrested him on preliminary charges connected to murder, child molesting, and criminal confinement. The arrest was a stunning reversal of a case that had spent decades moving in the opposite direction. For years, the headline had effectively been the same: 8-year-old girl murdered, killer unidentified. Now the headline changed. 30 years after April disappeared, police had arrested a suspect. The community that had lived with the case for an entire generation suddenly had a name to attach to the crime. The investigators who had inherited the case from earlier generations were now standing at the point where evidence, technology, genealogy, and persistence had finally converged. At a press conference, officials emphasized the significance of the moment. Fort Wayne Police Chief Steve Reed said that April's family had waited 30 years for answers. Prosecutor Karen Richards described the case as one that had haunted the community. But even after an arrest, the story was not over. An arrest is not a conviction. The investigation had to move into court. Formal charges were filed against Miller in July 2018, accusing him of murder and child molesting. The allegations describe the abduction of April from a Fort Wayne street on Good Friday in 1988, her kill, and the disposal of her body in rural DeKalb County. Investigators had now assembled multiple layers of evidence: the original forensic material, the later evidence left by the offender, genetic genealogy, confirmatory DNA obtained from Miller's discarded belongings, and statements attributed to Miller during his police interview. The case that had once seemed almost impossible to solve had become one of the most striking demonstrations of how old evidence can acquire new meaning when technology changes. The DNA had not suddenly appeared in 2018. It had been there for years. The difference was that investigators finally had a method capable of turning an anonymous biological profile into a path toward a person's identity. The evidence had waited. Science caught up with it, and the family that had waited 30 years finally had an answer to the question that had dominated their lives. But there was another layer to the story, one that made the case particularly disturbing. For years, the person responsible had apparently left traces of himself behind. The 1990 barn door message, the 2004 notes, the photographs, the condo, the threats, the evidence that once seemed like nothing more than fragments of a terrifying mystery eventually became part of the chain that investigators used to connect the crime to a specific man. In that sense, the killer's own actions helped preserve the trail that eventually led back to him. He had tried to control the story. He had tried to frighten the community. He had apparently believed that the passage of time would protect him, but time had done something else. It had allowed forensic science to advance. It had allowed investigators to revisit evidence with new tools. It had allowed genealogy to transform distant biological relationships into investigative leads, and it had allowed a case once considered painfully stagnant to move again. In December 2018, Miller pleaded guilty to charges related to April's murder. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. The courtroom resolution could not undo what happened on April 1st, SIL 1988. It could not restore the years April should have lived. It could not erase the memories of the family that had spent decades carrying an absence through birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, and ordinary days that never felt ordinary again. But it answered the central question that had remained unanswered for 3 decades. Who killed April Tinsley? The answer was John D. Miller, and the road to that answer had crossed 3 decades of investigative work. It had passed through conventional police work, witness information, physical evidence, DNA testing, renewed cold case review, genetic genealogy, surveillance, and confirmatory forensic analysis. The case also became part of a broader transformation in American cold case investigations. Genetic genealogy would go on to attract enormous attention because it demonstrated something investigators had long hoped for. DNA evidence did not necessarily become useless simply because a database lacked the offender's name. A genetic profile could reveal relatives. Relatives could reveal family structures. Family structures could narrow a search. And eventually, traditional forensic testing could confirm whether investigators had found the right person. But April's story should never be reduced to a technological breakthrough. Before there was a DNA breakthrough, there was an 8-year-old girl whose family expected her to come home. Before there was genetic genealogy, there was a frightened community searching for a missing child. Before there was an arrest, there were detectives who kept returning to evidence that had already been examined. Before there was a courtroom, there was a ditch beside a rural road and a family receiving the news that every parent fears. That is what makes the April Tinsley case so haunting. The technology changed, but the loss did not. The evidence changed in value, but the victim did not. April remained 8 years old while the calendar moved forward without her. 30 years passed for everyone else. For April, there was no passage of time. Her photograph stayed frozen at the age she was when she disappeared. The case files grew thicker. Investigators changed. Methods changed. Technology changed. But the central fact never changed. A child had been taken, murdered, and left behind. The arrest in 2018 finally ended the uncertainty surrounding the identity of her killer, but it also exposed just how long a criminal can remain hidden when the evidence is waiting for the right scientific tool. The story began in 1988 with a missing child and ended 3 decades later with a DNA match and an arrest. In between were thousands of days of uncertainty, a community repeatedly confronted by disturbing messages, investigators refusing to let the case disappear, and evidence preserved long enough for modern science to finally understand what it could reveal. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes the answer is already sitting inside the evidence room. Sometimes the clue is already there. Sometimes the name is buried inside a family tree that no investigator could have constructed 30 years earlier. And sometimes the person responsible believes that time has erased the trail behind him, when in reality, time is carrying the evidence toward a future in which the technology will finally be capable of reading it. For April Tinsley, that future arrived in 2018. 30 years after Good Friday became the day her family lost her, investigators finally had the identity of the man responsible. The mystery that had haunted Fort Wayne for a generation was no longer a mystery. The photograph remained. The memories remained. The questions about why remained. But the question of who was finally answered, and after 30 years of silence, the name attached to April Tinsley's murder was no longer hidden in an anonymous DNA profile, an old police file, or a forgotten message on a barn door. It was a name investigators could finally take to court. John D. Miller. The cold case had finally been broken. The evidence had finally spoken. And April's name, after 3 decades of uncertainty, finally had an answer. For 30 years, the evidence waited in silence. It waited inside old police files, inside evidence bags, inside photographs, inside memories that had never been allowed to fade completely. And somewhere inside that evidence was a biological signature that investigators could not yet turn into a name. In 1988, the technology simply was not capable of doing what investigators would eventually accomplish in 2018. The DNA could tell them that the same unknown offender had been connected to the crime, but it could not tell them who that offender was. That distinction would define the April Tinsley investigation for decades. The case had evidence. What it did not have was an identity. April had disappeared on April 1st, still 1988, while walking toward a friend's home to pick up an umbrella. She was only 8 years old. 3 days later, her body was discovered in a ditch approximately 20 miles from her Fort Wayne neighborhood. The case immediately became one of the most disturbing murders in the region, but the investigation quickly encountered the wall that would define so many cold cases of that era. Investigators could reconstruct pieces of what had happened. They could gather physical evidence. They could speak with witnesses. They could preserve biological material. But the person responsible remained beyond reach. And then came the messages. The killer did something that many offenders never do. He left behind communications connected to the murder. Years after April's death, investigators encountered threatening material that referred to the crime and appeared designed to remind the community that the person responsible had never been caught. In 2004, the case became even more disturbing when notes connected to April were discovered around Fort Wayne and Grabit. Some were associated with young girls' bicycles. Used condoms were also found in connection with the messages, providing investigators with additional biological evidence. What had once been a case built around a single devastating crime was now surrounded by a disturbing trail of evidence that appeared to come from the same offender. The killer was effectively leaving pieces of himself behind, yet the pieces still did not produce a name. For investigators, this created a strange contradiction. The case was not empty, it was full. There was physical evidence. There was DNA. There were threatening notes. There were photographs. There were witness accounts. There was a history of behavior that investigators could analyze. What was missing was the bridge between evidence and identity. Traditional DNA databases did not provide the match they needed. The profile existed, but it did not belong to someone already identified in the system in a way that solved the case. That meant the investigation could move only so far. Detectives could say what the DNA represented. They could say that biological material recovered from different pieces of evidence was connected, but they could not walk into a courtroom and point to the person who had left it there. That was the nightmare of the case. The answer appeared to be sitting inside the science, but the science had not yet learned how to read the answer. For years, investigators continued to work the case. In 2009, the FBI joined the investigation, describing it as highly solvable and assisting local authorities in another effort to identify the offender. Investigators reviewed evidence and information that had accumulated over more than 2 decades. They pursued leads. They interviewed people. They examined old material with the knowledge that even one overlooked detail could potentially change everything. But another breakthrough did not come immediately. The case remained open. For April's family, the passage of time was cruel in a way that statistics could never explain. April remained 8 years old. Everyone else grew older. The people who remembered the original investigation aged. Detectives retired. New detectives inherited files created before they had entered law enforcement. Technology changed. Fort Wayne changed. The world changed. But the question remained fixed in place. Who had taken April? Who had killed her? And who had been leaving messages that seemed to taunt investigators years later? Then the science began to change the equation. Across the United States, investigators were discovering that genetic genealogy could transform cold case investigations. Instead of requiring an exact match in a conventional law enforcement DNA database, investigators could use genetic information to identify relatives of an unknown person and then reconstruct family relationships. The method did not magically produce a suspect. It created a path. A distant relative could become a starting point. A family tree could become a map. And somewhere at the end of that map could be the person investigators had been searching for. In the April Tinsley case, that possibility became real in 2018. Fort Wayne Police Detective Brian Martin arranged for advanced genetic testing in May of that year. Parabon Nanolabs was brought into the investigation, and genetic genealogist Cease Moore became involved. The goal was extraordinary. Take DNA connected to a murder committed 30 years earlier and use modern genetic analysis to narrow the field of possible offenders. The work produced a result that investigators in 1988 could hardly have imagined. The genetic information pointed toward a family. More specifically, investigators were able to narrow the search to 2 full brothers. That did not immediately mean either brother was the killer. Genetic genealogy was an investigative tool, not a substitute for conventional forensic confirmation. But after decades without a name, investigators suddenly had a direction. 2 brothers. One family, one branch of the tree that demanded closer examination. The unknown offender was no longer an anonymous figure hidden behind a DNA profile. He was becoming a person. The investigation focused on John D. Miller and his brother. Miller was 59 years old and living in Grabille, Indiana. 30 years earlier, April had disappeared in Fort Wayne. The distance between those 2 facts was measured not merely in miles, but in decades. Investigators now had to determine whether Miller was actually connected to the biological evidence. This was the moment when genealogy had to give way to forensic confirmation. If the theory was correct, Miller's DNA should match the biological evidence preserved from the crime. If the theory was wrong, investigators would have to start again. Detectives began looking for a way to obtain a direct comparison without alerting Miller to the investigation. They examined material from his discarded trash. Among the items recovered were used condoms. The DNA extracted from that material was compared with the DNA already associated with the April Tinsley investigation. The result was the confirmation investigators had been waiting for. The DNA from Miller's discarded material was consistent with the profile recovered from April's underwear and with DNA associated with the later taunting evidence. The genetic genealogy had pointed toward Miller. The forensic testing strengthened the identification. Suddenly, the 30-year-old mystery was no longer an anonymous biological puzzle. Investigators had a specific man whose DNA was connected to the evidence. But even then, the investigation had to move carefully. A cold case that had survived for 30 years could not be treated casually. Every step had to be documented. Every piece of evidence had to be examined. Investigators had to make certain that the person they were approaching was not merely a genetic relative of the real offender. The comparison from Miller's discarded material was therefore critical. It provided investigators with a direct forensic connection rather than relying solely on a family tree hypothesis. The technology had opened the door. Traditional police work had to walk through it. On July 15th, SIL 2018, investigators went to Miller's residence in Grabille. The man they had been searching for, according to authorities, was no longer an abstract figure from a 30-year-old file. He was standing behind a front door in Indiana. Detectives asked Miller to accompany them to the Fort Wayne Police Department. He agreed. The moment was extraordinary because the investigation had traveled from a child's disappearance in 1988 to a suspect's home 3 decades later. Miller had lived through those years while the investigation remained open. The detectives now had the evidence they believed connected him to April, but they still needed to hear what he would say. According to the probable cause affidavit, investigators asked Miller why he believed they wanted to speak with him. His response was immediate and chilling. He said April Tinsley. That response was documented in the affidavit. For investigators, the significance was enormous. They had not yet told him the reason for the interview in those terms, according to the account reported from the affidavit. Yet he named April himself. The 8-year-old girl, whose photograph had been preserved in the case file for 30 years, was suddenly at the center of an interview with the man investigators believed was responsible for her death. The investigation had crossed another invisible line. It was no longer only about what the evidence might say. It was now about what the suspect might reveal. Investigators questioned Miller about the disappearance and killing. According to the affidavit, he made incriminating statements describing the abduction, sexual assault, and killing of April. Authorities said he admitted abducting her, raping her, and choking her to death. He also reportedly described what happened to her body afterward. These were allegations recorded in the probable cause affidavit and later reported by multiple news organizations. The statements gave investigators another layer of evidence, one, that existed alongside the DNA evidence that had brought them to Miller in the first place. The cold case had suddenly become an active criminal prosecution. Outside the police station, the news began moving rapidly. After 30 years of unanswered questions, April's family was finally hearing that an arrest had been made. The reaction was not simple celebration. There was shock. There was disbelief. There was grief. There was the realization that the man investigators believed had taken April had lived through 30 years while her family had carried the consequences of what happened to her every day. April's mother, Janet Tinsley, had feared that an arrest might never come. She had lived with the possibility that her daughter's killer could remain unidentified forever. Now, in 2018, that possibility had changed. Prosecutor Karen Richards described the case as one that had haunted the community for 30 years. Police Chief Steve Reed emphasized that April's family had waited decades for answers. Those statements reflected something larger than a single arrest. The case had become part of the identity of the community itself. People who were children in 1988 had become adults. Adults had become grandparents. Yet the name April Tinsley remained connected to one of the darkest mysteries in the region. The arrest meant that the mystery was finally moving toward a courtroom. But the evidence that made the arrest possible also told another story, one about persistence. The investigators who worked the case in 1988 could not have known exactly how powerful the preserved DNA would become 30 years later. The detectives who joined the investigation decades afterward inherited evidence they did not create. The genetic genealogist did not create the original profile, and the laboratory scientist did not create the crime. Each generation simply added another layer to the investigation. That is what made the breakthrough possible. The April Tinsley case therefore became a demonstration of how a cold case can remain alive even when every obvious lead appears exhausted. The biological evidence had survived. The investigative file had survived. The memories had survived. And eventually, the technology caught up. What had once been an unknown DNA profile could now be compared against information from relatives. What had once been a family connection could then be tested against a suspect's own discarded DNA. What had once been a theory could become evidence. The sequence was slow. It took decades, but it worked. And as the news of Miller's arrest spread, one question that had haunted Fort Wayne for 30 years suddenly had an answer. The man investigators had been searching for was no longer an unknown offender. He had a name. He had an address. He had been identified through a combination of old evidence and new science. But the story had not yet reached its final legal chapter. An arrest could provide a moment of enormous relief, but it could not erase the violence committed in 1988. It could not return April to her family. It could not undo the years of unanswered questions. The next stage would have to determine what happened when the evidence was placed before the court, and whether the man identified through that remarkable chain of DNA, genealogy, surveillance, and forensic confirmation would accept responsibility for the crime that had haunted Fort Wayne for an entire generation. The investigation had finally found its suspect. Now the case would have to confront the justice system, and after 30 years of waiting, every piece of evidence would matter. The arrest changed the April Tinsley investigation in an instant, but it did not erase the 30 years that had come before it. For 3 decades, the case had existed in the uneasy space between known facts and unanswered questions. April was dead. Her killer had been unknown. The evidence existed, but the identity attached to that evidence did not. Then, in July 2018, investigators placed a name beside the DNA profile. John D. For the first time since April's body was discovered in 1988, authorities could publicly identify the man they believed was responsible. But an arrest was only the beginning of the final stage. Now prosecutors had to transform a 30-year investigation into a criminal case that could survive in court. Every piece of evidence had to be examined again. Every statement had to be documented. Every forensic connection had to withstand scrutiny. And at the center of the case was the evidence that had finally broken the wall: DNA. The biological material connected to April's murder had been preserved for years. The later evidence left by the offender had created additional DNA opportunities. Investigators had never stopped understanding the importance of that evidence. What had changed was the technology available to analyze it. In 2018, genetic genealogy helped investigators identify a family connection, narrowing their attention to John Miller and his brother. But that genetic genealogy result was not the final identification. Investigators needed Miller's own DNA. That is why the discarded material collected from his trash became so important. According to authorities, detectives recovered used condoms and obtained DNA from them. The resulting profile matched the DNA associated with the April Tinsley investigation. The genetic genealogy had pointed toward Miller. The forensic comparison provided the confirmation. What followed was even more significant. When Miller was brought in for questioning, investigators did not simply present him with a DNA report and end the interview. They questioned him about April. According to the probable cause affidavit, Miller knew exactly who the detectives meant when they began asking why he believed they wanted to speak with him. He said April Tinsley's name. That moment became one of the most disturbing details in the case because the name belonged to a child who had been murdered 30 years earlier. Investigators then questioned Miller about what happened. According to the affidavit, he made statements admitting his involvement in April's abduction, sexual assault, and killing. The statements became another part of the evidence supporting the charges. But the case was never going to be judged solely by what happened inside that interrogation room. The history of the investigation mattered. April had disappeared on April 1st, Sill 1988, after leaving a friend's house to retrieve an umbrella. 3 days later, her body was found in a rural ditch in DeKalb County. A witness had reported seeing a man forcing a girl resembling April into a blue pickup truck. Investigators had followed leads for years, but no suspect had been successfully identified. The physical evidence, however, remained, and later, the killer appeared to leave messages that kept April's name alive in the investigation. In 1990, a message was discovered on a barn door near the location where April's body had been found. The writer claimed responsibility for her murder and threatened to kill again. In 2004, more notes appeared in the Fort Wayne area, some placed on bicycles belonging to young girls. Investigators believe these messages were connected to April's killer. Those later incidents became crucial because they produced additional evidence and reinforced the possibility that the offender was still active long after the original murder. For investigators, The 2004 messages were particularly disturbing. 16 years had passed since April's death, yet someone was apparently still using her name. Someone was still leaving material that investigators believed was connected to the original offender. The case was no longer simply a historical investigation. It had a living shadow. The person responsible might have been moving through the same community, watching the investigation, knowing that detectives still did not know his identity. The messages seemed designed to exploit that uncertainty, but there was a hidden danger for the offender. Every new piece of biological material created another opportunity for science. The killer may have believed he was controlling the narrative, but every trace he left behind was another potential future comparison. That future eventually arrived. The case also demonstrated why evidence preservation matters so much in old investigations. In 1988, investigators could not have known that genetic genealogy would become a major forensic investigative technique decades later, yet the evidence was preserved. That preservation meant that when DNA science advanced, investigators could return to material that had been collected long before the technology existed to fully exploit it. The evidence had not changed. The tools had. That difference was enough to transform the investigation. In May 2018, Detective Brian Martin arranged for advanced DNA testing. Parabon Nanolabs analyzed the genetic information, and genealogist Cease Moore used genetic genealogy to help identify potential relatives of the unknown offender. The investigation narrowed the possibilities to two brothers. John Miller became the focus, but detectives still needed confirmation before moving forward. This is where the case became a remarkable combination of modern science and traditional police work. Genetic genealogy could indicate a relationship. It could suggest that the unknown offender belonged to a particular family, but detectives needed a direct DNA comparison. They obtained material from Miller's trash and sent it for testing. The results supported the conclusion that Miller's DNA matched the evidence associated with April's murder and the later communication. Investigators had moved from a 30-year-old unknown profile to a specific suspect through a chain of scientific and investigative steps. The case had effectively been rebuilt from the biological evidence outward. When Miller was arrested, authorities did not describe the breakthrough as a miracle. They described it as the result of persistence and technology. The investigation had survived because detectives continued to revisit the evidence. The DNA had survived because it had been preserved. The genetic genealogy had worked because investigators were able to generate a useful profile, and the final identification was strengthened through traditional forensic testing. It was not one clue. It was a chain. Remove one link, and the investigation might have remained unresolved. That chain now had to be tested in court. Prosecutors filed formal charges against Miller in July 2018. The allegations included murder, child molesting, and criminal confinement. The charges described a crime that had happened 30 years earlier, but the prosecution now had evidence created across multiple decades. The oldest evidence came from the original investigation. The newest evidence came from modern genetic testing. Between those 2 points were the threatening messages, additional biological evidence, renewed investigative work, and the genetic genealogy breakthrough. The entire history of the case had suddenly become relevant. The courtroom process also meant that the public would hear details that investigators had kept inside the case file for years. But the central question remained the same. Would Miller contest the allegations, or would he accept responsibility? The answer came later that year. In December 2018, John D. Miller pleaded guilty to the murder of April Tinsley and related charges. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. The legal resolution finally gave the case an ending that investigators had been unable to reach for 30 years. Yet the guilty plea did not make the story simple. A conviction can establish legal responsibility, but it cannot restore what was lost. April was still 8 years old when the crime ended her life. Her family still had to live with the years that followed. The community still had to confront the fact that the person responsible had apparently remained unidentified for an entire generation. The arrest and conviction answered the central question of who was responsible, but they also forced people to look backward at the years during which the killer remained free. How had the case survived? Why had the original investigation not identified him? What evidence had been overlooked? And how had modern genetic genealogy accomplished what conventional methods could not? These questions made April Tinsley's case important beyond Fort Wayne. It became an example of how technology could reopen a case that had been considered nearly impossible to solve. The same principle would later influence other investigations around the country. DNA that once could establish only a biological connection could now become the beginning of a family tree investigation. An unknown suspect could become an unknown relative. The unknown relative could become a branch of a family, and that family could eventually point investigators toward an individual. But investigators still needed to confirm the lead through conventional forensic methods. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrated that balance clearly. For years, the case had been described as a cold case because the killer's identity was unknown. The term itself carries a strange weight. It suggests inactivity. It suggests that the investigation has stopped. But the April Tinsley case showed that cold does not necessarily mean dead. The evidence was still there. The DNA was still there. The case file was still there. The victim's name was still there. What had disappeared was not the possibility of solving the crime, but the immediate ability to see how it could be solved. That distinction mattered. A cold case can remain dormant for years and then move with extraordinary speed when a new technology or new piece of evidence changes the investigative landscape. In April's case, the transformation happened within months. Genetic genealogy narrowed the field. Investigators identified Miller as a potential suspect. DNA from discarded material provided confirmation. The police interview produced alleged admissions. Formal charges followed. And within the same year, Miller entered a guilty plea. 30 years of uncertainty had been compressed into a few months of extraordinary investigative activity. But the emotional timeline was different. For April's family, those 30 years could not be compressed. Every birthday that passed without her was part of the cost. Every anniversary of April's disappearance brought the case back into focus. Every new lead that failed meant another period of disappointment. Every public appeal carried the hope that perhaps someone would finally recognize something investigators had missed. The arrest changed the future, but it could not rewrite the past. That is why the photographs of April became so powerful after the arrest. They represented the child who had disappeared in 1988, not the suspect who had finally been identified in 2018. The case was never really about the killer. It was about April. The technology was not the hero. The police were not the hero. The DNA was not the hero. April was the reason the investigation continued. Her name was the reason detectives kept returning to the evidence. Her family was the reason the case could never simply become another forgotten file. And the final identification mattered because it restored one essential thing that had been missing for 30 years: accountability. The case also exposed the strange relationship between time and forensic evidence. Investigators often speak of the passage of time as an enemy. Witness memories fade. People move. Documents disappear. Locations change. Technology becomes outdated, but time can also become an ally when evidence is preserved. Scientific methods that did not exist in 1988 became available in 2018. The biological material collected decades earlier suddenly became far more informative. The evidence had been waiting for the future. In that sense, the April Tinsley investigation was not solved despite the passage of time. It was solved partly because the evidence survived long enough for new science to reach it. That is what makes the case so striking. A killer who had remained hidden for 30 years was not discovered because someone suddenly remembered his name. He was identified because an old biological trace could finally be connected to a modern family tree, and then connected again to the man's own DNA. The investigation crossed decades in a single chain of evidence, and when the chain reached John Miller, the cold case finally had a suspect, a prosecution, and ultimately a guilty plea. The story that began with a missing 8-year-old girl ended with a courtroom acknowledgement of responsibility, but the emotional ending was never going to be as clean as the legal one. Justice could establish accountability. It could not give April back. It could not restore the childhood she never had, the years she never lived, or the future that was taken from her. What it could do was end one terrible uncertainty. For 30 years, the question had been whether April's killer would ever be known. In 2018, that question was answered. and the answer came from a combination of evidence that had survived since 1988 and science that had not yet existed when April was alive. The lesson was brutal but powerful. A case can go silent without truly disappearing. Evidence can wait. Technology can change. Investigators can return, and a name hidden for decades can eventually emerge from a strand of DNA, a distant relative, a discarded object, and a family tree. For April Tinsley, the silence lasted 30 years. Then, suddenly, it was broken. The killer had a name. The evidence had a match. The courtroom had a plea, and the little girl whose photograph had remained frozen in time finally had an answer to the question that had haunted her family and her community for an entire generation. The most haunting thing about a cold case is not always the absence of evidence. Sometimes it is the presence of evidence that seems to lead nowhere. In the April Tinsley investigation, investigators had spent years surrounded by fragments of the truth. There were witness accounts. There were physical traces. There were threatening messages. There was biological evidence. There was DNA. Yet for decades, none of those pieces could be assembled into a complete picture. April had disappeared in Fort Wayne on April 1st, still 1988, and her body was discovered 3 days later in a ditch in DeKalb County. A witness had reported seeing a man force a girl resembling April into a blue pickup truck, but the description did not produce a suspect. The investigation expanded, and the community waited. Then the case became even more disturbing when messages connected to April appeared years later. The first major message came in 1990 when words claiming responsibility for April's murder were found on a barn door near the location where her body had been recovered. Investigators believed the writer was the person responsible for April's death and interpreted the message as a threat to kill again. The crime had already traumatized the community. Now, someone appeared to be deliberately reopening the wound. The question became not only who killed April, but who was still watching, who knew details about the crime, who had the confidence to leave a message so close to the place where April's body had been found, and why would anyone take the risk of drawing attention back to a murder that had already gone unsolved? Those questions remained unanswered. The message did not provide a name. It provided fear. Years passed again. Then, in 2004, the investigation was pulled back into the public consciousness when more disturbing notes appeared in the Fort Wayne area. Some were placed on bicycles belonging to young girls. The notes referenced April. Used condoms and photographs were also found in connection with the messages. Investigators believe these incidents were connected to the same offender. If that assessment was correct, the person responsible for April's murder had not disappeared into the past. He had apparently continued to leave traces of himself in the present. The evidence became both frightening and potentially valuable. Every biological trace created another opportunity for investigators to compare DNA. Every written message created another chance to examine handwriting or language. Every photograph created another potential lead. But the identity remained hidden. For the public, the 2004 developments created a terrifying contradiction. The case was more than 16 years old, yet the person responsible seemed capable of reaching back into the community. Parents who had grown up with the April Tinsley story now had children of their own. Young girls were receiving attention from an unknown offender who appeared to know about the original murder. The fear was no longer confined to memories of 1988. It had become contemporary again. Investigators had reason to believe the offender was still somewhere in the region, but knowing that the killer might still be alive was not the same as knowing who he was. That distinction continued to frustrate the investigation. Traditional DNA testing could identify the biological profile. It could demonstrate whether two pieces of evidence came from the same person. But if the offender's profile did not match someone already identified in a law enforcement database, the technology could reach a dead end. The profile essentially became a biological fingerprint without a name attached to it. That was the position investigators found themselves in. The DNA could say, in effect, this is the same person, but it could not say, this is John Miller. That missing connection became the central problem. The investigation required a new method. It needed a way to move from biological identity to genealogical identity. That possibility emerged as genetic genealogy became increasingly important in cold case investigations. Instead of asking whether an unknown DNA profile matched a known offender, investigators could ask whether the profile was related to people whose DNA had been submitted to genealogical databases. The answer could lead to distant relatives. Those relatives could reveal family structures. Genealogists could then reconstruct those structures until investigators reached a small number of possible individuals. It was painstaking work. It was not a magic search button. It required genetics, genealogy, public records, family relationships, and traditional investigation. But it offered something that the old system could not: a route forward when there was no direct database match. The April Tinsley case became one of the most dramatic examples of that new approach. In 2018, investigators revisited the evidence with advanced DNA analysis. Parabon Nanolabs became involved, and genetic genealogist Cease Moore helped analyze the information. The genetic evidence ultimately pointed investigators toward two brothers. One of them was John D. Miller. The case had suddenly moved from an anonymous offender to a short list of possible relatives, but investigators still had to answer the most important question. Was Miller actually the man whose DNA had been recovered from the April Tinsley evidence? The answer could not be based simply on a family tree. A relative could share genetic characteristics without being the offender. Investigators needed direct confirmation. That is why they watched Miller and obtained material from his discarded trash. Among the items recovered were used condoms. Laboratory analysis produced the comparison investigators wanted. The DNA associated with Miller's discarded material matched the genetic profile connected to the Tinsley investigation. The genealogy had identified the family. The forensic test identified the man. Suddenly, 30 years of uncertainty had been reduced to a specific suspect. The significance of that moment is difficult to overstate. Imagine an evidence file created in 1988. Imagine biological material collected when DNA technology was still in an early stage. Imagine investigators being able to preserve that material without knowing whether it would ever produce an answer. Then imagine 3 decades later, a completely different scientific method turning that old profile into a family connection. The evidence had effectively crossed time. What detectives could not do in 1988, investigators in 2018 could attempt with technology that did not exist when April was alive. It was not simply a new clue. It was a new way of reading an old clue. And once investigators had the DNA connection to Miller, they moved quickly. On July 15, still 2018, authorities went to his home in Grabit. Miller agreed to accompany investigators to the Fort Wayne Police Department there. According to the probable cause affidavit, he was questioned about April Tinsley. The investigators had already built a significant evidentiary case before the interview began. They had the genetic genealogy lead. They had the DNA comparison. They had the historical evidence. Now they needed to hear Miller's response. The interview would become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation. According to authorities, when investigators asked Miller why he thought they wanted to speak with him, he identified April Tinsley by name. That detail was chilling because April's murder had occurred 30 years earlier. Her name was not a random detail. It was the center of the investigation. The interview then moved into the events surrounding April's disappearance. According to the probable cause affidavit, Miller made statements acknowledging his role in the crime. Authorities said he admitted abducting April, sexually assaulting her, and choking her to death. Those statements, combined with the DNA evidence, gave investigators the basis for arresting him. For the detectives who had worked on the case, the moment must have represented the end of an extraordinary investigative journey. But for April's family, the news had an entirely different meaning. A name had finally replaced the word unknown. For 30 years, they had lived without knowing who had taken April now. Authorities were telling them they had identified the man. The answer brought relief, but it also reopened memories that had never truly disappeared. The case had been part of their lives for so long that solving it could not simply erase the years of uncertainty. There was also the disturbing realization that the man investigators believed responsible had apparently lived a normal life while the case remained unresolved. He had grown older. He had a home. He had family connection. He had existed in the same world as the people who were still looking for him. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of many cold cases. The offender does not necessarily disappear into some remote place. Sometimes the person remains in the same general region, living an ordinary-looking existence while the investigation continues around him. The April Tinsley case demonstrated that possibility in a particularly stark way. Miller was living in Indiana when investigators finally connected him to the crime. The technology that identified him was not a confession obtained by accident. It was the result of a chain that began with evidence collected decades earlier, and that chain became stronger because investigators did not rely on a single method. The genetic genealogy produced the investigative lead. The discarded DNA provided a direct comparison. The police interview produced statements described by authorities as incriminating. Each element reinforced the other. The case that had once depended on fragments now had multiple independent lines pointing toward the same man. The legal system would determine what those facts meant, but the investigative mystery had effectively been solved. In the days after the arrest, details of the breakthrough became public. Officials emphasized the importance of the technology and the persistence required to keep the case active for 30 years. The April Tinsley investigation became a national example of the potential of genetic genealogy. It showed that old DNA evidence could become newly useful when investigators had access to modern analytical techniques. It also demonstrated why cold case detectives continued to revisit evidence that had previously produced no result. A case that failed under one scientific method might succeed under another. The evidence did not become better. The technology became better. That distinction became central to the broader discussion of forensic genetic genealogy. The method could generate leads, but it could not replace traditional confirmation. Investigators still had to identify a suspect, obtain a suitable comparison, establish the connection, and build a prosecutable case. The April Tinsley investigation followed that model. The prosecution then moved forward. Miller faced charges related to April's murder and other offenses. The evidence collected over 30 years was now part of an active criminal case. The public had spent decades wondering whether anyone would ever be held accountable. Now there was a defendant, but there was also a courtroom, and the courtroom demanded something different from the investigation. Investigators had been asking, who did this? Prosecutors now had to prove what happened and establish Miller's legal responsibility. The distinction between suspicion and proof became critical. Genetic genealogy could point toward an individual. DNA could connect that individual to biological evidence. Statements could provide additional support. But ultimately, the legal process would decide the case. Then, in December 2018, Miller pleaded guilty. The 30-year mystery had reached its legal conclusion. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. The plea meant that the case would not require a lengthy trial to establish his guilt. The man investigators had identified through the combination of genealogy, DNA, and traditional police work accepted responsibility in court. Yet even with the guilty plea, there was an uncomfortable truth at the heart of the case. Justice had arrived 30 years late. For April's family, no sentence could restore those missing decades. The legal system could impose punishment, but it could not return the child who had vanished on that April afternoon. The community could finally stop asking who was responsible, but it could not stop remembering why the question had mattered. The case, therefore, became both a story of extraordinary forensic progress and a reminder of the cost of unresolved violence. April's death was not solved by technology alone. It was solved because people preserved evidence, followed leads, revisited old information, and refused to allow the case to become irrelevant. The breakthrough came only when all of those efforts intersected. That is why the April Tinsley investigation remains significant. It shows what can happen when a cold case is given another chance. A profile once considered insufficient can become useful. A family tree once unrelated to a police investigation can become a map. A discarded object can become the final confirmation, and a suspect who had remained unidentified for 30 years can suddenly become the center of an active investigation. The case also demonstrates the strange power of time. Time can destroy evidence. It can also preserve evidence until science catches up. In April's case, the latter happened. The biological material survived long enough for investigators to apply a technique that had not existed when the murder occurred. The evidence had been silent for decades. Then science gave it a voice, and once it spoke, the investigation moved with astonishing speed. The name John Miller became connected to April Tinsley's murder. The arrest came. The charges followed. The guilty plea followed those charges, and an 80-year sentence finally closed the legal chapter. But the emotional chapter could never be closed in the same way. April remained the center of the story, not the suspect, not the technology, not the investigators. April, the little girl who left a friend's house to retrieve an umbrella and never came home. The child whose disappearance became a murder investigation. The victim whose name appeared years later in messages that terrified a community. The case that remained unresolved while an entire generation grew older. The photograph that never aged, and the DNA profile that waited 30 years for science to reveal whose body had left it behind. That is the image that remains when the headlines disappear. Evidence sealed away, a family waiting, investigators refusing to forget, and a child whose name survived long enough for the truth to finally catch up. The April Tinsley case was cold for 30 years, but it was never truly dead. The evidence was alive. The investigation was alive, and eventually the science became strong enough to connect the two. 30 years after the crime, the unknown offender was no longer unknown. The mystery had been broken. The case had been solved, and the answer had been waiting inside the evidence all along. The April Tinsley investigation had reached the moment every cold case detective hopes to see, but solving a murder and proving a murder are not the same thing. For 30 years, investigators had been trying to answer one question: who killed April? By July 2018, they believed they had the answer. John D. Miller had been identified through a combination of genetic genealogy, traditional investigation, and DNA testing, but the case still had to survive the legal process. The evidence had to be organized, the timeline had to be reconstructed, the statements had to be examined, and the events of April 1st, SIL 1988, had to be placed before a court. What made the case extraordinary was the sheer span of time covered by the evidence. Some of the most important material dated back to the original investigation. Other evidence came from years later, when the offender appeared to have continued leaving traces connected to April, and the final breakthrough came from technology that had not existed when the crime occurred. The case had effectively become a bridge between two different eras of criminal investigation. In 1988, investigators were working with eyewitness accounts, physical evidence, conventional forensic methods, and the investigative techniques available at the time. In 2018, they were working with advanced DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy. The same case file had survived both worlds. The DNA profile that once seemed incapable of identifying the offender became the starting point for a family tree investigation. That family tree narrowed investigators toward John Miller. Then DNA recovered from discarded material associated with Miller provided the crucial confirmation. According to authorities, the DNA matched evidence from the original crime and later material connected to the offender. The science had moved the case from possibility to identification. But there was still the interview. When investigators brought Miller to the Fort Wayne Police Department on July 15, SIL 2018, they were no longer questioning a random person. They had already assembled a substantial evidentiary foundation. The interview became an opportunity to hear what Miller would say when confronted by investigators. According to the probable cause affidavit, Miller knew the subject of the investigation almost immediately. He identified April Tinsley by name. Investigators then questioned him about the events surrounding her disappearance and death. Authorities later said that Miller made incriminating statements describing the abduction, sexual assault, and killing. Those statements were included in the probable cause affidavit and became part of the basis for the criminal charges. The interview transformed the case yet again. Now investigators had not only biological evidence connecting Miller to the crime, but statements attributed to him about what had happened. The arrest that followed was extraordinary because of how long the case had remained unresolved. April's murder had occurred 30 years earlier. Entire stages of the investigation had come and gone. Detectives who had worked the original case were no longer necessarily the people handling it. Technology had advanced dramatically. Public attention had shifted. yet the case remained active enough for investigators to keep pursuing it. The eventual breakthrough was therefore not the product of one sudden discovery. It was the result of layers accumulating across decades. The original crime created the biological evidence. The later messages created additional evidence. Investigators preserved the material. Cold case detectives revisited the file. Genetic genealogists analyzed the DNA. Police identified a potential suspect. Traditional DNA testing confirmed the connection, and then the suspect's own statements became part of the case. Each stage depended on the previous one. Without the original evidence, there would have been no DNA profile. Without preserved evidence, there would have been nothing for modern technology to analyze. Without genetic genealogy, the profile might have remained unidentified. Without traditional DNA testing, the genealogical lead might never have become a confirmed suspect. Without the interview, investigators would have had a different evidentiary picture. The case was solved through convergence. That is what makes it so significant. It was not a single miracle test. It was a chain of investigative decisions made over 30 years. The public reaction to the arrest reflected the unusual nature of the case. The April Tinsley murder had become part of the collective memory of Fort Wayne. Her name had been known for decades. Her disappearance had been discussed by generations of residents. The later messages had reminded people that the person responsible had never been identified. For many people, the case had become one of those crimes that seemed destined to remain unresolved forever. Then, in 2018, the headline changed. Police had arrested a man in connection with the 1988 murder. The age of the suspect was itself striking. Miller was 59. He was no longer the young man he would have been in 1988. He was a man approaching 60, decades removed from the original investigation. Yet, according to investigators, his DNA connected him to the crime. The passage of time had not erased that biological connection. It had only delayed the moment when investigators could use it. For April's mother, Janet Tinsley, the arrest carried an emotional weight that could not be measured by the language of a police press conference. She had spent 30 years living with uncertainty. The question was not simply whether April's killer would ever be caught. It was whether the family would ever know who had done it. A cold case can create a particular kind of grief because the absence of a suspect leaves a permanent question hanging over everything. The family knows what happened to their loved one, but not who caused it. There is no face to attach to the crime, no name, no courtroom, no final legal answer. The arrest changed that. Authorities could finally tell the family that the investigation had reached a suspect, and when the suspect later pleaded guilty, the legal uncertainty ended. The guilty plea did not erase the grief, but it provided something the family had lacked since 1988, accountability. The prosecution's case was also a demonstration of how cold case evidence can gain strength when different forms of evidence are combined. DNA evidence is powerful, but investigators still need context. Genetic genealogy can identify potential relatives, but it does not automatically establish guilt. A suspect's statement can be important, but it must be evaluated alongside the physical evidence. The April Tinsley case contained all of these elements. The genealogy pointed investigators toward Miller. The DNA comparison linked him to biological evidence. The police interview produced statements authorities characterized as incriminating together. The evidence created a compelling investigative picture. And then Miller pleaded guilty. The case did not need to depend on a jury resolving every disputed issue after a lengthy trial. The guilty plea provided the legal conclusion. In December 2018, Miller received an 80-year prison sentence. The man who had remained unidentified for 30 years was now facing the consequences of the crime. But there was another reason the case attracted attention far beyond Indiana. The investigation showed what genetic genealogy could do when conventional DNA databases fail to identify a suspect. The method had already begun transforming investigations in the United States, but every successful case created new questions about how far the technology could reach. In April Tinsley's case, the unknown DNA profile was analyzed for genetic relationships. Instead of searching only for a direct match, investigators searched for biological connections. That shift in strategy changed everything. It was like replacing a single missing photograph with an entire family album. The unknown person might not appear directly in the database, but relatives could, and those relatives could reveal a family structure. Once investigators understood the structure, they could narrow the possibilities. That is what happened here. Two brothers emerged as significant possibilities. John Miller became the focus. Then investigators used discarded DNA to determine whether the theory was correct. The result supported the identification. This distinction is critical because forensic genetic genealogy is not the same thing as a conventional DNA match. Genealogy generates a lead. Traditional forensic testing provides confirmation. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrated that sequence clearly. The science did not replace police work. It gave police a new direction. Detectives still had to surveil Miller. They still had to obtain comparison DNA. They still had to question him. They still had to build the legal case. Technology opened the door, but investigators had to walk through it. The case also revealed how much information can remain hidden in evidence for decades. When April was murdered in 1988, investigators could not have predicted the future of forensic genetics. They could not have known that genealogy databases would one day contain information capable of identifying distant relatives. They could not have known that computers would allow researchers to construct complex family trees from genetic relationships. They could not have known that investigators would eventually use those relationships to solve a murder committed before the internet had become part of everyday life. Yet the evidence survived. That is the crucial point. Evidence does not need to reveal everything immediately to remain valuable. Sometimes its value is delayed. A fingerprint can become more useful when databases improve. A photograph can become more useful when image technology advances. A DNA sample can become dramatically more informative when sequencing and genetic genealogy evolve. The April Tinsley case is a powerful example of delayed forensic value. The evidence was collected in one technological era and solved in another. The same biological material existed before the breakthrough and after it. What changed was the ability to interpret it. For the investigators, that meant returning to old evidence with fresh eyes. Cold case work often requires exactly that mindset. A case may have been investigated thoroughly in its own time and still contain information that could not be understood until later. Saying that a case was not solved in 1988 does not mean the investigators failed. It means the available tools reached their limits. The detectives of 2018 inherited those limits and then pushed beyond them. That is why the eventual arrest should be understood as a continuation of the original investigation rather than a completely separate event. The evidence collected in 1988 remained the foundation. The detectives who worked the case later built upon that foundation. The genetic genealogists added another layer. The laboratory testing added another. The interview added another. And finally, the legal system turned the accumulated evidence into a conviction. For the public, however, the most chilling element remained the offender's apparent decision to keep the case alive through later messages. The 1990 barn door message and the 2004 notes had transformed the crime from a single terrible event into a continuing mystery. The person investigators were looking for appeared to understand that April's murder remained unsolved. He appeared willing to remind the community of that fact. Yet those communications may also have helped investigators preserve the biological trail that ultimately led to him. Every new trace carried risk. Every discarded item could become evidence. Every message could connect the offender to the past. In the end, the very confidence that seemed to protect the killer may have contributed to the evidence investigators eventually used against him. That is one of the most disturbing paradoxes of the case. The offender appeared to believe that he could control the fear surrounding April's murder, but the evidence he left behind became part of the chain that eventually exposed him. Time did not protect him. Time preserved the evidence. Technology did not erase the crime. Technology made the evidence more powerful, and the family that had waited 30 years finally received an answer. When Miller pleaded guilty, the April Tinsley case ceased to be an unsolved murder. It became a solved crime with a known offender and a prison sentence. But the word solved can be misleading when viewed from the perspective of the victim's family. A case can be solved legally while remaining emotionally unfinished. The legal system can announce a sentence, but grief does not follow a court calendar. April's family still had to live with everything that happened after April disappeared. The years did not come back. The birthdays did not come back. The ordinary moments did not come back. The sentence was 80 years, but April's life had ended at 8. That contrast cannot be repaired by any courtroom. What the case could provide was certainty. Certainty about the offender, certainty about accountability, certainty that the investigation had finally reached its destination, and that certainty mattered. For 30 years, the family had been forced to live with the possibility that April's killer might never be identified. Now they knew. The name was John D. Miller. The evidence had connected him to the crime. He had pleaded guilty, and the court had sentenced him. The mystery had ended, but the story of the investigation remained important because it demonstrated something that every cold case detective understands. Time does not necessarily destroy the truth. Sometimes it buries it. Sometimes it hides it inside evidence that no one can yet interpret. And sometimes, years later, someone develops the tool needed to uncover it. April Tinsley's case waited 30 years for that moment. The evidence survived. The investigators returned. The family never stopped remembering, and eventually, a DNA profile that had once been anonymous became a path to a family tree. A family tree became a suspect became a DNA match, and a DNA match became an arrest. The final legal answer came only months later, when Miller pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 80 years. The cold case was no longer cold, but the image that remained was not the arrest photograph or the courtroom. It was April herself, frozen forever at 8 years old, while the world around her continued to change. Her killer grew old. The detectives changed. Technology advanced. New generations grew up knowing only the name of the case, yet April's name remained. 30 years could not erase it. And when modern science finally opened the locked door inside the evidence, that name was still there, waiting to be heard. By the time investigators returned to the April Tinsley case with modern genetic technology, the investigation had already accumulated 30 years of history. That history mattered because the breakthrough did not begin in 2018. It began in 1988, when an 8-year-old girl disappeared from her Fort Wayne neighborhood and was later found dead in rural DeKalb County. It continued in 1990, when a message appeared on a barn door near the location where April's body had been discovered, claiming responsibility for her murder and threatening another killing. It continued again in 2004, when 4 disturbing notes appeared around Fort Wayne, several placed on bicycles belonging to young girls, accompanied by used condoms or Polaroid photographs. The FBI later described the case as containing a significant trail of evidence left by the offender. In 2009, when federal agents joined Indiana investigators in a renewed effort, they believed the case was still highly solvable. But at that moment, the identity of the killer remained unknown. That was the contradiction that defined the investigation. The evidence was there. The killer had apparently left evidence behind. Yet the evidence could not produce the one thing detectives needed most: a name. The 2004 material was particularly valuable because it appeared to connect the same offender to April's murder 16 years after the original crime. Investigators could examine the notes, the photographs, the objects left with them, and the biological material. The FBI even developed an offender profile based on behavior demonstrated from 1988 through 2004. Agents believe the killer was a white male, likely in his 40s or 50s by 2009, with strong ties to Northeast Fort Wayne and Allen County. Investigators were trying to reduce a massive population of possibilities into a manageable group of suspects. But a behavioral profile is not an identification. It can tell detectives what kind of person they may be looking for, where that person might live, and what characteristics may be relevant. It cannot put handcuffs on someone. The DNA was potentially more precise, but the DNA profile still needed a comparison, and without that comparison, it remained an anonymous biological signature. The passage of time made the problem more complicated. People who might once have remembered something had moved away. Some had forgotten details. Some potential witnesses were no longer available. Places had changed. Neighborhoods had changed. The world in which April disappeared was becoming increasingly distant. Yet one thing had not changed: the biological evidence. That evidence did not have a memory problem. It did not forget. It did not move away. It did not grow old. It remained what it had been from the beginning, waiting for investigators to find a way to extract more information from it. This is one of the most important facts about forensic evidence in a cold case. Human memory deteriorates, technology improves, and sometimes those two forces work in opposite directions. The witness who remembered a suspicious vehicle in 1988 might remember less in 2009. But the DNA collected in 1988 could become more informative in 2018. The evidence itself could effectively become stronger while the human trail around it became weaker. That possibility would ultimately define the Tinsley investigation. In 1988, forensic DNA analysis was itself an emerging technology. The FBI laboratory began conducting forensic DNA casework that year, illustrating just how early the technology was in the broader history of criminal investigation. A crime committed at the beginning of the DNA era could therefore contain evidence whose full investigative potential would not be understood for decades. That technological timeline is crucial to understanding why the Tinsley case remained unsolved for so long. Modern viewers often imagine DNA as an instant identification system. A sample is collected, a computer produces a name, and detectives make an arrest. Real investigations are rarely that simple. DNA can establish that biological material came from a particular person or is consistent with a particular person, but investigators still need a reference profile or a method of identifying whose biological material they are examining. If the offender's DNA is not already associated with an identifiable individual, the profile can remain anonymous. That was the obstacle investigators faced for years. The DNA told them they had a real person behind the evidence. It did not tell them where that person lived. It did not tell them what his name was. It did not tell them where to find him. It was evidence without an address. Then genetic genealogy changed the possibilities. Instead of searching only for a direct match, investigators could look for relatives. The concept was revolutionary because it transformed the question. They no longer had to ask, who is this exact person? They could ask, who might this person be related to? If relatives could be identified, genealogical research could potentially reconstruct a family tree. That tree could narrow the search to specific branches and eventually specific individuals. But it remained an investigative technique rather than an automatic answer. A genetic relative was not necessarily the offender. Investigators still needed traditional police work and direct forensic confirmation. In the Tinsley case, that distinction became essential. When advanced DNA testing was pursued in 2018, investigators were able to move beyond the anonymous profile. Genetic genealogists Cease Moore became involved, and the analysis ultimately directed investigators toward a family containing two brothers. One of those brothers was John D. Miller. For detectives who had spent years looking at an unknown offender, the significance was enormous. The name did not come from a witness suddenly remembering him. It came from the biological relationships embedded in the DNA. But investigators could not simply declare the case solved because a genealogy analysis had produced Miller's name. That would have been an enormous investigative leap. They needed confirmation, so they returned to traditional forensic strategy. Investigators monitored Miller and obtained discarded material from his trash. Among the items recovered were used condoms. Laboratory analysis of that material provided the direct DNA comparison investigators needed. The biological evidence connected to Miller was consistent with the DNA already associated with the Tinsley investigation. The genealogical lead had become a forensic identification. That was the moment the 30-year mystery changed character. Before that point, investigators were looking for an unknown person. After that point, they were investigating a known individual. The distinction may sound simple, but it represented decades of work. An unknown offender can be anywhere. A known suspect can be investigated. Detectives can examine his history. They can compare his movements with the timeline. They can interview him. They can search for additional evidence. They can present the evidence to prosecutors. Once investigators had Miller's identity, the case could finally move through the conventional criminal justice system. The next step was the interview. On July 15, SIL 2018, investigators went to Miller's home in Grabille, Indiana. He agreed to go with them to the Fort Wayne Police Department. The detectives already knew why they wanted him there. They had the genetic genealogy lead. They had the DNA comparison. They had the historical evidence. Now they wanted his account. According to the probable cause affidavit, Miller was asked why he believed investigators wanted to speak with him. He responded by naming April Tinsley. That detail would become one of the most chilling moments in the investigation. 30 years had passed since April's murder. Yet, according to investigators, Miller immediately connected the interview to her name. The conversation then moved into questions about April's disappearance, and authorities said Miller made incriminating statements about the crime. Those statements were documented in the affidavit and later reported publicly for investigators. The convergence was striking. The DNA had led them to Miller. The direct comparison had supported the identification, and the interview, according to authorities, produced statements that connected Miller to the crime. The investigation had moved through 3 different forms of evidence: genetic relationships, biological comparison, and statements. Each layer strengthened the others. But there was still something haunting about the timing. 30 years earlier, investigators had been trying to identify the person who abducted April. In 2009, federal agents were still knocking on doors and asking residents whether they remembered suspicious people, Polaroid camera, or details surrounding the threatening messages. The FBI's behavioral analysts had even developed a detailed profile of the offender. Investigators had worked day and night, recanvassing neighborhoods and seeking DNA samples from possible suspects. Yet the case remained unsolved. 9 years later, technology had changed the investigative equation. The same crime scene evidence that had resisted identification could now be examined through genetic genealogy. The breakthrough did not invalidate the work of the earlier investigator. It demonstrated why cold cases must remain open to new methods. What looks like a dead end under one scientific approach can become a doorway under another. The evidence does not necessarily become different. The questions investigators ask of it become different. That is precisely what happened in the Tinsley case. For decades, detectives asked whether the DNA matched anyone they already knew. In 2018, they asked whether the DNA could identify relatives of the unknown offender. That new question produced a new path, and that path led to Miller. The public reaction to the arrest was intense because the case had been part of Fort Wayne's history for so long. People who had been children in 1988 were adults in 2018. Some had raised families of their own. April's murder was not simply an old newspaper story. It was a memory that had been passed through generations. The threatening messages had reinforced the fear because they suggested that the person responsible had remained free. When Miller was arrested, that uncertainty suddenly ended. The killer was no longer a faceless figure. Authorities had identified a specific man. The family could finally attach a name to the person they believed responsible for April's death. But that name also carried another disturbing reality. Miller had been living in the same state where the crime had occurred. The passage of 30 years had not transported the offender to some distant, unreachable world. The person investigators had been seeking was living an ordinary life while the case remained open. That fact made the arrest even more difficult for the community to process. A cold case suspect can seem almost mythical before identification. Once a name is attached, the mystery becomes frighteningly human. The killer is no longer an unknown silhouette. He is a person who existed in the same society as everyone else. Yet the most important transformation was not psychological. It was legal. The evidence now had to be taken into court. Miller faced formal charges connected to the murder. Prosecutors had to establish that the man identified through the investigation was legally responsible. The decades-old evidence would have to survive the scrutiny of the justice system. The genetic genealogy would be part of the investigative story, but the direct DNA comparison and other evidence would be essential. The case had moved from the world of investigative possibility into the world of legal accountability. Then came the guilty plea. In December 2018, Miller pleaded guilty and received an 80-year sentence. The legal chapter had ended with an admission of guilt rather than a jury verdict. After 30 years, the case finally had its conclusion. Yet the word conclusion can be misleading. A criminal case can conclude in court while the human consequences continue indefinitely. April's family had waited 30 years for the identity of her killer. The guilty plea provided an answer, but it could not restore the years that had been lost. April was still the 8-year-old girl who disappeared in 1988. She had never grown older. Her family had, the investigators had, the technology had, the suspect had, the community had. April remained frozen in the photographs from the case. That contrast is one of the most painful realities of homicide investigation. The victim's life ends at one moment, but everyone else continues moving through time. Birthdays continue. Seasons change. Children grow up. New technologies appear. Old detectives retire. New detectives take over, but the victim remains exactly where the crime left them. In April's case, that image remained at the center of the investigation for 3 decades. The photograph reminded investigators why they were still searching. The evidence reminded them that the truth might still be recoverable, and eventually, modern science connected the two. The case became an example of what persistence can accomplish when evidence is preserved long enough. It also became a warning against assuming that time automatically protects an offender. 30 years had passed, but the biological trail remained. The offender had changed with age. His DNA had not changed in the way that mattered for identification. The investigation had slowed. Science had accelerated. And eventually the two met. That meeting produced a name, John D. Miller. It produced an arrest. It produced charges. It produced a guilty plea. And it produced an 80-year sentence. But perhaps the most powerful part of the story is what happened before the breakthrough. For decades, nobody knew whether the case would ever be solved. Investigators could only continue. The FBI could issue a plea. Detectives could revisit evidence. Families could keep April's name in the public consciousness, and evidence could remain preserved. There was no guarantee that any of it would work. That uncertainty is what makes cold cases so difficult. Investigators are often working without the promise of an ending. They pursue leads that may fail. They examine evidence that may provide nothing. They speak to people who may not remember. They return to files that have already been examined. They keep going because the possibility of an answer remains. The April Tinsley case demonstrates the value of that persistence. In 2009, the FBI said investigators believed the case was highly solvable, even though the killer remained at large. 9 years later, that belief proved justified. The case was not solved because the evidence suddenly appeared. It was solved because the evidence had been preserved and investigators eventually gained a method capable of interpreting it. And that is where the story of April Tinsley reaches its most unsettling point. The killer had spent decades unidentified, but he had never truly been separated from the evidence. The DNA remained connected to him even when investigators did not know his name. The later messages appeared to connect him to the case again. The objects he left behind created additional forensic opportunity. The family tree eventually exposed a possible identity. His discarded material confirmed it, and his own words, according to investigators, became another piece of the case. 30 years of silence had not erased the trail. It had only concealed it. The evidence was still there, waiting for the right question, the right technology, and the right investigators to bring it back into focus. When that happened, the cold case did not slowly awaken. It moved rapidly. A genealogy lead became a suspect. A suspect became a DNA match. A DNA match became an arrest. An arrest became a guilty plea. And a 30-year mystery became a documented criminal case. The story of April Tinsley, therefore, stands as a reminder that a cold case is not necessarily an abandoned case. Sometimes it is a case waiting for time itself to change the tools available to investigators. April's murder happened in a world where DNA profiling was only beginning to enter criminal investigations. Her killer was identified in a world where genetic relationships could be used to navigate an enormous family tree. Between those two worlds stood 30 years of persistence. And at the end of that persistence was a name that investigators had searched for since 1988. The name was finally known. The evidence had finally been connected. The courtroom had finally delivered a sentence. But the photograph of April remained exactly as it had always been, a reminder that behind every breakthrough in forensic science is a victim whose life was taken long before the technology arrived to help solve the crime. April's case was no longer an unanswered question, but the reason it mattered was never the technology. It was the child at the center of it, the child whose disappearance shocked Fort Wayne, the child whose murder remained in police files for 30 years, the child whose name appeared again in messages long after her death, and the child whose case ultimately demonstrated that even decades of silence cannot always bury the evidence forever. The name John D. Miller had finally replaced the word unknown, but the investigation had not simply discovered a suspect. It had uncovered the endpoint of a trail that had stretched across 3 decades through a child's disappearance, a murder scene, disturbing messages, preserved biological evidence, failed leads, renewed investigation, and finally a scientific breakthrough that changed the meaning of DNA evidence. To understand why the arrest was so significant, it is necessary to return to the evidence that had remained hidden in plain sight for years. When April Tinsley's body was discovered in a rural ditch in DeKalb County 3 days after she disappeared from Fort Wayne, investigators were faced with a crime that had already taken an enormous emotional toll on the community. April was only 8 years old. Her disappearance had begun as a desperate search for a missing child. Her discovery transformed it into a homicide investigation. The investigators who arrived at the scene had no idea that the case would eventually become one of Indiana's most notorious cold cases, or that the biological evidence collected during those early hours would remain important 30 years later. They were working with the tools of 1988. They were trying to reconstruct what happened, identify the person responsible, and understand how April had been taken from her neighborhood. A witness reported seeing a man force a girl matching April's description into a blue pickup truck. That information gave investigators a possible vehicle and a possible offender description, but it did not provide enough to identify the man. The investigation expanded. Tips came in. Residents were questioned. Leads were followed, but the killer remained unidentified. Then, as the years passed, the case developed another disturbing dimension. In 1990, a message appeared on a barn door near the place where April's body had been found. The message claimed responsibility for April's murder and threatened another killing. For investigators, the message was horrifying, but it was also potentially valuable. Whoever had written it appeared to know details about the crime. The writer appeared to be deliberately connecting himself to April. If the message was authentic, the offender was effectively announcing that he was still free. The case was not simply an old tragedy. It was still alive in the mind of someone who knew what had happened. That possibility would become even more disturbing in 2004 when additional notes appeared around Fort Wayne. Some were placed on bicycles belonging to young girls. The material referred to April and was accompanied by used condoms and photographs. Investigators believed the same person was responsible for the messages and the original murder. That belief meant the case now contained a long behavioral and forensic trail. The offender had apparently left evidence in 1988, returned to the case in 1990, and then appeared again in 2004. Each appearance created another opportunity to identify him, yet for years the name remained out of reach. Archives.fbi.gov. The FBI became involved in a renewed investigation in 2009. Agents described the case as highly solvable and worked with local authorities to review evidence and conduct new interviews. Investigators examined the messages, the photographs, and the biological material. They tried to determine whether the offender had a connection to Northeast Fort Wayne or Allen County. A behavioral profile was developed. Investigators believed the offender was a white male and estimated that by 2009 he would likely have been in his 40s or 50s. The profile was not enough to identify him, but it helped establish the parameters of the search. Investigators were essentially looking for a man who had managed to remain invisible while leaving behind evidence that he was connected to one of the most disturbing crimes in the area. The problem was not that investigators lacked theory. The problem was that no theory could be conclusively connected to the biological evidence. That is, where the DNA profile became so important. DNA could distinguish one person from another with extraordinary precision, but the investigators still needed a reference sample. If the offender was not already identified in a database, the profile could remain anonymous. The biological evidence could prove that the same person had left different traces, but it could not provide his name. This was the central obstacle for years. Investigators had what amounted to a fingerprint from the body, but no database entry telling them whose fingerprint it was. Then the forensic world began changing. Genetic genealogy created a new way to search for unknown offenders. Instead of asking whether the unknown DNA profile belonged to someone already identified, investigators could search for genetic relatives. The approach was based on a simple but powerful biological fact. Relatives shared DNA. A distant relative might not be the offender, but that relative could reveal the family from which the unknown person came. Genealogists could then build family trees, eliminate individuals who did not fit the circumstances, and narrow the search. It was not automatic. It was investigative work requiring expertise, records, genetic analysis, and verification, but it offered a route where traditional databases had failed. In the spring of 2018, the April Tinsley investigation took that route. Detective Brian Martin arranged advanced DNA testing Parabon, Nanolabs, analyzed the evidence, and genealogists Cease Moore used genetic genealogy. The results eventually pointed investigators toward a family with two brothers. One was John D. Miller. After 30 years, investigators finally had a name worth investigating. But they did not arrest him immediately. The genealogy result was a lead. The detectives needed to establish whether Miller's own DNA matched the evidence. That is why investigators collected discarded material from his trash. Used condoms were among the items recovered. The DNA obtained from those items provided the direct comparison investigators needed. The results matched the biological evidence connected to the Tinsley case. The anonymous DNA profile now had a person attached to it. The case had crossed the most difficult boundary in cold case investigation, the distance between evidence and identity. See BezNews.com. The investigators now had to decide how to approach Miller. They knew the biological evidence. They knew the genealogical connection. They had the history of the case, and they had the later messages that appeared to connect the offender to the same crime. On July 15, 2018, authorities went to Miller's home in Greville. He agreed to accompany them to the Fort Wayne Police Department. Inside the interview room, investigators asked questions about April. According to the probable cause affidavit, Miller identified April by name when asked why he believed detectives wanted to speak with him. That moment was significant because the investigators had not been seeking a random confession. They already believed the DNA evidence connected Miller to the crime. The interview was an additional investigative opportunity. According to authorities, Miller then made statements describing his involvement in April's abduction, sexual assault, and killing. Those statements became part of the probable cause supporting the charges. The case had now accumulated evidence from multiple eras. Biological evidence from 1988, messages and biological material from later years, modern genetic genealogy from 2018, direct DNA comparison from Miller's discarded material, and statements attributed to Miller during questioning. It was a chain extending across 30 years. The arrest was announced publicly, and the reaction was immediate. The April Tinsley case had been one of those crimes that many people assumed might never be solved. The word cold case had become part of its identity. The murder had happened before many people in the community had even been born. Yet suddenly investigators were standing before the public announcing that they had arrested a suspect. The breakthrough also attracted national attention because of the genetic genealogy technique. The case demonstrated how DNA from an unknown offender could potentially be used to identify relatives and eventually narrow the search to a specific individual. For law enforcement, it was an example of a new investigative frontier. For April's family, it was something much more personal. 30 years of uncertainty had finally been replaced by a name. Janet Tinsley, April's mother, had lived with the possibility that the person responsible might never be identified. Now authorities were telling her that they believed they had found him. The emotional impact was profound. There was relief because the mystery had finally been answered. There was grief because the answer forced the family to confront the details of the crime again. There was anger because the person responsible had remained free for so long, and there was the painful realization that nothing could restore April's life. A cold case arrest can close an investigative question without closing the emotional wound. The family still had to live with what happened, but the legal system could now begin the process of accountability. Formal charges were filed against Miller. The allegations included murder and other offenses connected to April's death. The prosecution now had to convert a 30-year investigation into a case that could be resolved in court. The evidence had to be presented in a form that met legal standards. The DNA connection would be central. The statements would be important. The history of the investigation would establish the context. The later messages and biological evidence would help explain how the case had developed. But perhaps the strongest element was the convergence of independent investigative methods. Genetic genealogy had pointed toward Miller. Traditional DNA testing had connected him to the biological evidence. Investigators had then obtained statements during questioning. Each stage reinforced the next. The result was a case that did not depend on one technological trick. It depended on technology and traditional investigation working together. This distinction became particularly important as the public began hearing more about genetic genealogy. The technique was sometimes described as though it could simply identify anyone from any DNA sample. The reality was more complicated. The DNA had to be suitable for the analysis. Genetic relationships had to be identified. Genealogical research had to be conducted carefully. Potential suspects had to be evaluated against the facts of the case, and then direct forensic testing was needed to confirm the identity. The April Tinsley investigation followed that progression. The genealogy did not convict Miller. It helped investigators find him. The direct DNA comparison and the rest of the evidence formed the basis of the case. See bestnews.com. That distinction also reveals why the evidence preserved from the original investigation was so valuable. If investigators had not retained the biological material, there would have been nothing for modern science to analyze. The technological breakthrough would have arrived too late, but the evidence had survived. It had remained in the investigative record. The passage of time had not erased its value. In fact, time increased its value because scientific capabilities expanded. The April Tinsley case therefore became a powerful example of why cold cases should not be judged only by the tools available when the crime occurred. A case that seems impossible in one decade can become solvable in another. Science does not move at the same speed as a criminal investigation. A technique may be experimental when evidence is collected and routine years later. That is what happened here. The biological evidence existed before the modern genetic genealogy revolution. The evidence waited while the science evolved. When the science caught up, investigators were ready to use it. The final legal resolution came quickly compared with the decades that preceded it. In December 2018, Miller pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 80 years in prison. The case that had remained unresolved since 1988 had moved from arrest to guilty plea within months. That speed made the contrast with the previous 30 years even more striking. For most of the investigation, the answer had seemed impossibly distant. Once the identity was established, the legal process moved rapidly. The cold case had become an active prosecution almost overnight, but the sentence did not erase the years of uncertainty. It simply established accountability going forward. April's family still carried the history of what happened. The community still carried the memory of the little girl whose disappearance had shocked Fort Wayne. The case still carried the disturbing record of messages that had appeared long after April's death, and the evidence remained a reminder of how close the truth had been all along. There is a particular cruelty in a case like this. The evidence existed. The answer existed. The killer existed. But the connection between those things was missing. For 30 years, that missing connection prevented justice. Then a new scientific method created it. The genetic genealogy did not discover a new piece of evidence. It discovered a new relationship between existing evidence and the world around it. That relationship became the key. The unknown DNA profile was no longer isolated. It belonged to someone with relatives. Those relatives belonged to families. Those families led investigators toward Miller. Then his discarded DNA confirmed the connection. The mystery had not been solved by luck. It had been solved by reconstructing the hidden relationships inside the evidence. And once that reconstruction was complete, the case became almost impossible to ignore. The same biological signature that had been anonymous for decades now pointed toward one man. The case that had once generated public fear now generated a courtroom proceeding. The killer, who had remained unnamed, now faced an 80-year sentence, and April's family finally had an answer. But the deepest legacy of the case remained the lesson that evidence can outlive the limitations of the era in which it was collected. A detective in 1988 could not see what a genetic genealogist could see in 2018. A laboratory in 1988 could not perform the same analysis that modern laboratories could perform 30 years later. The evidence was the constant, the technology was the variable. That is why the April Tinsley case continues to matter. It demonstrates that a cold case can remain dormant without being hopeless. It demonstrates that preserving evidence can create possibilities decades later. And it demonstrates that a victim's name can remain powerful enough to bring investigators back to the same questions again and again. April was 8 years old when she disappeared. She never had the opportunity to grow older, to graduate, to build a career, to create a family, or to experience the ordinary future that should have been hers. The man investigators identified lived through those years. He aged while April remained forever 8. The technology that ultimately exposed him did not exist when April was alive, but the evidence created by the crime survived. And eventually, that evidence became the bridge between 1988 and 2018. The bridge led to John D. Miller. It led to an arrest. It led to formal charges, and it led to a guilty plea and an 80-year sentence. 30 years after the murder, the unknown finally had a name. The question that had haunted Fort Wayne for an entire generation finally had an answer. But the final image of the case is not the suspect being led away. It is April's photograph, still showing the little girl she was before everything changed. Around that photograph, 3 decades of investigation had accumulated. DNA, notes, photograph, witness accounts, police files, genetic genealogy, surveillance, laboratory testing, interviews, court records. All of it converged on one conclusion. The cold case was solved because the evidence never stopped waiting. And when the right technology finally arrived, it did something investigators had been unable to do for 30 years. It gave the evidence a name. The arrest of John D. Miller changed the April Tinsley case forever, but it also forced investigators, prosecutors, and the public to look backward through 3 decades of unanswered questions and examine how a crime that had once seemed almost impossible to solve could finally be reconstructed. For 30 years, April's name had remained connected to an empty space in the investigation, a question without a final answer. A photograph of a little girl surrounded by evidence that seemed unable to identify the person responsible. Now that the evidence had pointed to Miller, investigators could look at the old case through a completely different lens. Details that once seemed isolated suddenly belonged to a larger pattern. The blue pickup truck, the disappearance, the body found in the ditch, the message on the barn, the later notes, the biological evidence, the photograph, the DNA profile, the family connections, the discarded material, the interview. Each piece had existed separately for years, but only after Miller was identified could investigators see how those pieces fit together. That is one of the strangest characteristics of a cold case. Before an offender is identified, every clue seems to exist inside a fog. Investigators know the crime happened, but they do not know which details matter most. After identification, the same evidence can suddenly appear sharp. The old photographs become relevant again. The statements are reread. The timelines are reconstructed. The smallest inconsistencies receive attention. Investigators ask questions they could not have asked before because they now know where the evidence leads. In April's case, the turning point had been genetic genealogy, but the story behind that breakthrough was much larger. The DNA profile had existed for years. The technology had changed. That difference became the dividing line between 30 years of uncertainty and a rapidly developing prosecution. When genetic genealogists analyzed the DNA associated with the case, they were not searching for a photograph of John Miller. They were searching for biological relationship. The unknown offender's DNA was treated not simply as a forensic signature, but as a map of family connections. Somewhere inside that map was a route toward the person investigators were seeking. The route eventually led to Miller, but that was only the beginning. Investigators still had to confirm that the man identified through genealogy was actually the source of the biological evidence. The discarded DNA obtained from Miller's trash became crucial. The comparison supported the genealogical list. The unknown profile was no longer anonymous. It was associated with a specific individual. That was the moment the case moved from genealogical research into conventional forensic investigation. The police no longer had to search an entire region. They had a target. They could observe him. They could collect evidence. They could question him. They could compare his history with the evidence already preserved in the case file. The investigation had changed from a search for an invisible man into a focused examination of one individual. The significance of that transition becomes clearer when considering how many years had passed. April disappeared in 1988. By 2018, the world around the investigation had changed almost beyond recognition. Telephones had changed. Computers had changed. DNA technology had changed. Police databases had changed. The people who had been children when April disappeared were adults. Some original investigators had retired. Others had moved into different roles, yet the case had remained. The physical evidence had remained. April's name had remained. And the DNA had remained. The passage of time had created enormous obstacles, but it had also created an unexpected advantage: scientific progress. In the earliest years of the investigation, detectives could only work with the forensic capabilities available to them. Decades later, those capabilities had expanded dramatically. The evidence collected in 1988 could be revisited using techniques that investigators at the time could not have imagined. That is why cold case work often depends on patience. Investigators cannot control when science develops. They can only make sure that evidence survives long enough to benefit from that development. In April's case, that principle proved decisive. The biological evidence became the bridge between the past and the present. And once Miller had been identified, the investigation entered its most dramatic stage. On July 15, SIL 2018, authorities went to his home in Grabille, Indiana. Miller agreed to accompany investigators to the Fort Wayne Police Department. There, detectives confronted him with questions about April. According to the probable cause affidavit, Miller identified April by name when asked why he believed investigators wanted to speak with him. That detail was striking because April's murder had occurred 3 decades earlier. Investigators then questioned Miller about the events surrounding the crime. Authorities later said that Miller made statements acknowledging his involvement in April's abduction, sexual assault, and killing. Those statements became another critical element of the investigation. The case now had an unusual convergence of evidence. Genetic genealogy had produced a possible identity. Direct DNA testing had supported that identity. The police interview had generated statements that investigators characterized as incriminating, and the original evidence had remained consistent with the emerging theory. The unknown offender had become a named suspect, and the named suspect had become the center of a criminal case. Yet investigators also had to confront the disturbing history of the messages that appeared after April's death. The 1990 barn door message had been terrifying because it appeared to claim responsibility for the murder and threatened another killing. Then came the 2004 note. Their appearance transformed the case from a historical murder into something that seemed to reach into the present. The notes were reportedly left in locations around Fort Wayne, including on bicycles belonging to young girls. Some were accompanied by used condoms and Polaroid photographs. The FBI treated the material seriously and believed the same offender could be responsible. The messages created a psychological dimension to the case. Whoever was responsible seemed to understand the fear created by April's murder. He appeared to know that the crime remained unsolved. He appeared willing to use April's name to frighten people years after her death. That behavior made the offender seem almost untouchable. He had killed a child. he had avoided identification. Then he had apparently resurfaced. For investigators, the challenge was not only to determine who had killed April, but whether the person behind the later messages was the same person. The biological evidence became particularly important because it could potentially connect separate events. Unlike handwriting or behavioral similarities, DNA could provide a direct biological relationship. If the same DNA profile appeared in evidence from different incidents, investigators could establish that those incidents were connected by the same individual. That kind of connection was invaluable in a case where the offender seemed to have intentionally created confusion. The investigation, therefore, became a study in persistence. Every old piece of evidence had to be reconsidered. Every biological sample had to be evaluated. Every message had to be placed into the timeline. The goal was no longer simply to find someone who might have killed April. The goal was to reconstruct the entire evidentiary chain well enough to withstand legal scrutiny. This distinction mattered because an arrest is not the same as a conviction. Detectives can develop a strong theory, but prosecutors need evidence that can survive in court. A suspect can deny involvement. Defense attorneys can challenge forensic methods. Witnesses can have imperfect memories. Evidence collected decades earlier can raise questions about handling and preservation. A case that has been unsolved for 30 years carries an enormous amount of historical baggage. Investigators must show not only what they believe happened, but why the evidence supports that conclusion. The April Tinsley investigation had an advantage that many cold cases do not have. The DNA evidence provided a scientific connection that did not depend entirely on memories from 1988. The biological evidence had a direct relationship to the crime. The genetic genealogy helped identify the individual, and the subsequent comparison gave investigators additional support. That combination made the case unusually powerful. The public announcement of Miller's arrest therefore represented more than the capture of a suspect. It represented the end of a period in which April's killer could remain unidentified. For the family, the announcement carried an emotional force that no press conference could fully explain. For years, they had lived with uncertainty. They knew April had been murdered. They knew someone had taken her life, but they did not know who. Now there was a name. The name did not change what had happened. It did not restore April, but it changed the family's relationship with the past. There was finally someone who could be held accountable. There was finally a criminal proceeding. There was finally the possibility of a sentence. And when Miller later pleaded guilty, that possibility became reality. In December 2018, he pleaded guilty and received an 80-year sentence. The case that had remained unresolved since 1988 was now legally concluded. Yet the emotional meaning of the guilty plea was more complicated. For some families, a guilty plea provides a form of closure. For others, closure is too simple a word. Grief does not disappear because a defendant admits guilt. The victim does not return. The years lost do not return. The family still has to live with memories that cannot be rewritten. What the guilty plea can provide is certainty. The uncertainty surrounding the offender is removed. The family no longer has to wonder whether the person responsible will ever be identified. The community no longer has to wonder whether the killer is still among them. The investigators no longer have to carry an open question that has followed them for decades. The court has spoken. The offender has been sentenced. But April's story remains bigger than the sentence. It is a story about what happens when evidence survives longer than the technology available to interpret it. In 1988, investigators could collect biological evidence without knowing that decades later genetic genealogy would transform how unidentified DNA could be analyzed. They preserved the evidence because that was what investigators were supposed to do. 30 years later, that preservation became the foundation of the breakthrough. The lesson is simple but profound. Evidence does not need to reveal everything immediately to matter. Sometimes it has to wait. The April Tinsley case waited. The DNA waited. The technology evolved. And then the evidence finally became capable of answering the question that investigators had asked since the day April disappeared. Who did this? The answer was John D. Miller. But the path to that answer was not direct. It was a maze of time, evidence, uncertainty, and scientific progress. The investigation had moved through generations of detectives and generations of forensic technology. It had survived dead ends and unanswered questions. It had survived years when the offender appeared to have vanished. It had survived the fear created by the later messages. And eventually, it reached the moment when the unknown offender could no longer remain anonymous. That is why the April Tinsley case became such an important example of forensic genetic genealogy. It demonstrated that a DNA profile without a name does not necessarily mean the investigation is finished. It may simply mean investigators need to search differently. Instead of looking for the offender directly, they can sometimes look for the offender's relatives. Instead of searching a database for one person, they can reconstruct a family network. Instead of asking where the suspect is, they can ask where his biological family came from. Then, once a potential suspect emerges, conventional forensic methods can take over. The Tinsley investigation followed that path. The science pointed. The detectives verified. The laboratory compared. The investigators questioned, the prosecutors charged, the court sentenced. Every stage was necessary. None of it would have been possible without the evidence preserved from the original investigation. And that is perhaps the most haunting part of the entire story. The answer had been physically present for decades. It was not hidden in some secret room. It was not destroyed. It was not carried away by the killer. It remained inside evidence collected years earlier. What was missing was the ability to read it. 30 years passed before that ability arrived. By then, the little girl at the center of the case had become a symbol of everything a cold case represents. A life interrupted, a family waiting, a community remembering, and a trail of evidence refusing to disappear. April's photograph remained unchanged while everyone else aged around it. Her killer grew older. Investigators grew older. The technology changed. The case file grew thicker, but April remained 8. And when the investigation finally produced a name, it did not change her age or rewrite her final death. It simply answered the question that had remained unanswered for 30 years. The man responsible had been identified. The case had been solved. The legal system had delivered its sentence. Yet the silence surrounding April had lasted so long that the breakthrough itself became another part of the story. A DNA profile that once had no name became a family. The family became a suspect. The suspect became a DNA match. The match became an arrest. The arrest became a guilty plea, and the guilty plea became an 80-year sentence. 30 years of uncertainty had collapsed into a sequence of events that took place in a matter of months. But behind that rapid conclusion stood decades of work, decades of evidence,